This video is about a Dublin crime family known as the Kinahan Cartel, but this story begins in Dubai. The Burj Al Arab opened in Dubai in 1999 and quickly gained an almost mythical reputation as the world's only 7-star hotel. That rating is unofficial. Hotels are typically ranked from 1 to 5 stars, but the opulence of the place supports the legend. Its shape evokes a billowing spinnaker, and it sits on a man-made island with a half-acre of gold leaf inside. Inside, there is an aquarium-wrapped restaurant where a portion of beluga caviar goes for $700 and a helipad where Roger Federer once volleyed shots against Andre Agassi. In May 2017, two Dubliners, Daniel Kinahan and Kiva Robinson, chose this setting for their wedding. Kinahan, short and stocky with thinning dark hair and cold dark eyes, was approaching his 40th birthday. Robinson, in her mid-30s, had bottle blonde hair and teeth so white they looked almost unreal. It's fair to assume the speeches glossed over the newlyweds' past romantic entanglements. Robinson's previous partner, Micah Kelly, had been gunned down in Dublin in 2011, shot 14 times and then run over by a car. Beneath a massive chandelier in the Burj Al Arab's ballroom, the couple sat on thrones, surrounded by a vivid mix of relatives, friends, and business contacts. Among the guests was former heavyweight champion Tyson Fury, who has sometimes been managed by Kinahan, a supposedly boxing promoter known to law enforcement as the head of the Kinahan organized crime group. Social media had been forbidden, but Fury briefly tweeted his attendance before deleting the post. Also present were some of the world's most notorious cocaine traffickers: Ridouan Taghi, a Moroccan-Dutch kingpin linked to multiple murders in the Netherlands; Bosnian-Dutch smuggler Edin Gacanin, head of the Tito and Dino cartel; Chilean importer Ricardo El Rico Riquelme Vega; and Raffaele Imperiale, an Italian tied to the Camorra. Not long before the wedding, Italian authorities recovered 2 stolen Van Gogh paintings: View of the Sea at Scheveningen and Congregation Leaving the Reformed Church in Nuenen, at Imperial's parents' home near Naples. When so many major criminals gather in one place, investigators take notice. The US Drug Enforcement Administration had watched Kinahan for years, and one of its informants attended the wedding undercover. That source drew a map of the gangsters in attendance and secretly filmed the event for American agents. These insights showed that the men, many of whom were based in Dubai, were working together to launder money and move cocaine from South America into Europe. The DEA shared the intelligence globally, and soon the media and police in Europe dubbed them the Super Cartel. Europol later estimated that the network controlled roughly a third of Europe's cocaine market, worth about $20 billion annually, while the Irish police, An Garda Síochána, recently valued the Kinahan family's fortune at about $1 billion. Many of the cartel's high-ranking members have since faced justice. Taghi was arrested in Dubai in 2019 and sent back to the Netherlands. Its ports have become hubs for drug trafficking, where he was tried and sentenced to life in a heavily fortified courthouse nicknamed the Bunker. Even with security measures, the brother and lawyer of a state's witness and the crime journalist Peter R. de Vries were murdered during the proceedings. Gacanin was detained in Dubai in 2022 under the international Operation Desert Light and was later convicted in the Netherlands. He accepted a plea deal, receiving 7 years in prison and a €1 million fine. Riquelme is also serving time in the Netherlands with an 11-year sentence. Imperial, apprehended in 2021, was deported to Italy and now sits behind bars there. Yet Daniel Kinahan, whose attorney has declined many requests to speak on his status, remains free in Dubai. In April 2022, the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned the Kinahan organized crime group, likening it to Mexico's Los Zetas, Japan's Yakuza, and Russia's thieves-in-law. The US ambassador to Ireland announced a $5 million reward for tips leading to the arrest of Daniel, his father Christy Kinahan Sr., or his brother Christy Kinahan Jr. One retired DEA agent, though, said American law enforcement was focused on only one target. It's all about Dan. Portlaoise Prison sits in Central Ireland and dates from the 19th century. It feels more like a fortress than a correctional facility, and certainly offers no luxury. In 1997, 2 decades before the Dubai nuptials, Christy Kinahan Sr. found himself incarcerated in a vermin-infested section known as the E-Wing. Each inmate had a cell to himself and used a bucket for a toilet. Kinahan Sr. had grown up in a middle-class Dublin home, but began dabbling in small-time crime early, starting with cheque fraud. Dapper and capable of adopting a refined Anglo-Irish accent, he soon became a consummate conman. Irish gangland nicknames are famously colourful: the Penguin, the Viper, Fatso, and he earned the moniker the Dapper Don. By the late 1970s, heroin was devastating Dublin's inner-city neighbourhoods. Larry Dunn was the city's first major heroin importer, but his 1985 imprisonment left a void. Kinahan Sr. stepped in, and his activity drew the attention of a young detective named Michael O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan later explained that newcomers in the heroin trade often indulge in the drug themselves, but Kinahan Sr. seemed different. He wasn't an addict, and he ran his operation efficiently. In 1986, Detective O'Sullivan went undercover, posing as an electrician to follow Kinahan Sr. His efforts paid off when he caught Kinahan with a large stash of heroin. When police searched further, they found not just drugs, but other illegal goods and language tapes. Kinahan Sr. had been teaching himself French and Arabic. He was convicted and spent 6 years in prison before being released in 1992. Only a few months later, he was caught again, this time with stolen checks. The arresting officer described him as impressive, kind of intelligent, no aggression. After being granted bail, Kinahan Sr. vanished. By the mid-1990s, Ireland's criminal underworld had outgrown the capacity of its police. Drugs flowed freely, and kidnappings and bank robberies seemed unstoppable. In 1996, crime journalist Veronica Guerin was gunned down by a member of the Gilligan gang. The public outrage led the Irish government to form the Criminal Assets Bureau, which gave authorities the power to seize money and property from convicted criminals. That bureau had an unintended side effect. It transformed some Irish gangsters into international operators. Many Dublin mobsters decamped to Amsterdam, which at the time resembled a Star Wars cantina, full of notorious villains who could mingle freely, exchange contacts and collaborate. Kinahan Sr. became one of these expatriates, as did John Cunningham, who had escaped from prison in 1996 while serving a kidnapping sentence. Together, they shipped heroin, cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, and weapons to Ireland. During this period, Dutch police caught Kinahan Sr. with drugs and firearms and jailed him for a year, but he returned to business after his release. In 1997, he went back to Ireland for his father's funeral and was arrested for the check fraud that had prompted him to skip bail. This landed him in Port-Louis. David MacDonald, a guard on the E-Wing at the time, recalled an inmate unlike any he'd seen. The 40-year-old Kinahan Sr. dressed neatly in slacks and a buttoned shirt, rarely socialized or exercised with other prisoners, and was never found with alcohol or drugs. If violence erupted, he stayed in his cell. When he did interact with other inmates, he became a sort of jailhouse consultant, advising them on legal matters despite having no formal training. He also studied diligently, taking open university courses in Spanish, Russian, and Dutch. MacDonald was responsible for supplying his educational materials. According to MacDonald, Kinahan Sr. had a plan from the outset. The only contraband ever found on him was a cell phone, the first the guard had seen smuggled into Port-Louis. In 2001, he was offered early release for good behavior, but declined because he had 2 months left on a course. He felt he could concentrate better inside. He only left after finishing the class. MacDonald, chuckling, said he'd never heard of a prisoner turning down early release before. Detective O'Sullivan described Kinahan Sr. as a very strategic mercenary who learned from mistakes and remained cold and calculating. MacDonald noted a similar froideur. He said Kinahan Sr. rarely smiled and wasn't the kind of prisoner one could joke with about football or other trivial matters. The Kinahan brothers were born to John Boylan, who worked as a cleaner in inner-city Dublin. She and Kinahan Sr. separated when the boys were young, and they stayed with her. Boylan was never involved in crime except for her cleaning job at the local police station, where colleagues liked her despite her family connections. Boylan raised her children in the Oliver Bond Flats, a bleak housing project near the Guinness Brewery where crime was pervasive. A Dublin narcotics trial recently referred to the flats as an ideal place to sell drugs. Boylan didn't want her sons following their father's path, but they felt his pull. As Kinahan Sr. built a base in the Netherlands, Daniel, then in his late teens, began running drugs in Dublin for his father's network, according to several sources. Noel Brown, a retired detective inspector who often interviewed people connected to Daniel during those apprenticeship years, described him as a peacock, reveling in his inherited status. Brown said associates would call Daniel an arrogant fuck, who always wore the best clothes and surrounded himself with hoodlums. Daniel, Brown explained, possessed a superiority complex, but also worried his criminal peers thought he hadn't paid his dues, so he sometimes grew paranoid and asserted his authority. Daniel's younger brother, Christy Jr., was quieter and groomed for the more cerebral side of the business, money laundering. In the book The Cartel, authors Stephen Breen and Owen Conlon recount that police searching Gene Boylan's home would find Daniel spoiling for confrontation, while Christopher Jr. was unfailingly polite. Each brother knew his role. One evening, according to Breen and Conlon, Daniel even told his brother to watch a television documentary on money laundering to hone his skills. Meanwhile, Daniel forged alliances with other criminal outfits in Dublin, notably the Hutch family, which controlled the North Side projects. After his release from Port Loires in 2001, Kinahan Sr. relocated to Spain's Costa del Sol, then the preferred haunt of the old Amsterdam crowd. Journalist Nicola Tallant, host of the Crime World podcast, observed that to be taken seriously as a European organized crime outfit, one needed a foothold on the Costa. Spain was ideally positioned for cannabis imports from Morocco and offered abundant networking opportunities. Tallant called it a melting pot of mafias from across Europe, noting that Mexican and Colombian emissaries also frequented the region seeking partners. The Kinahan sons soon joined their father under the sun, operating largely undisturbed by Spanish authorities. British police got an early glimpse of Daniel's ruthlessness through his involvement in a betting syndicate that placed huge wagers on horse racing. The group would often bet on favourites to lose, a practice known as laying. In May 2004, jockey Kieran Fallon rode the favoured filly Russian Rhythm to victory in the Lockinger Stakes, apparently upsetting the syndicate's expectations. 11 days later, Daniel flew to England with 3 associates to confront Fallon at his home, but they aborted the mission when they noticed an unmarked police car tailing them. Police soon arrested the syndicate's leader, Miles Rogers, and several others for alleged race fixing. The case later collapsed due to flawed expert testimony. Though a 2009 hearing proved that some jockeys had succumbed to Rogers' pressure, Fallon, however, wasn't among them and actually enjoyed a better win rate during the suspect period, costing the syndicate hundreds of thousands. Rogers was permanently banned from UK racecourses for what regulators called wholesale corruption. Although Daniel didn't stand trial, the case revealed telling evidence about him. One intercepted call played to the jury featured Rogers saying he'd met many menacing people, but none as frightening as Kinahan. He described Daniel as only a little fella, but you know when you've been spoken to. Europe's cocaine market expanded significantly in the early 21st century, far outpacing the markets for heroin and synthetic drugs. A 2021 report from the think tank Insight Crime traced the boom in part to Colombian cartels who, pushed out of North America by Mexican organizations, looked across the Atlantic to a relatively untapped consumer base. They began forging partnerships with European gangs. Detective Michael O'Sullivan said the Kinahans sensed this shift early. He recalled that in 1982, he made Ireland's largest cocaine seizure at the time, a mere 110 grams. 2 decades later, cocaine arrived at Irish ports by the ton. O'Sullivan described an era in which criminals were buying up cocaine, the economy across Europe was improving, and the drug cut through every social stratum. Unlike heroin, he noted, cocaine was embraced broadly, and fortunes were being built on it. By 2009, the Kinahan enterprise in Spain had grown so big that government started to pay attention. A US embassy cable from Sierra Leone, published by WikiLeaks, described Daniel as an Irish businessman involved in narco-trafficking across Europe and suggested he might be expanding into West Africa. As the business scaled up, Kinahan Sr. professionalized his team. Members received anti-surveillance training, and Spanish police files show the group also taught hostage handling, target shooting, and martial arts. In The Cartel, the authors note that Spanish officers listening in on training sessions struggled to decipher thick inner-city Dublin accents. Their transcripts even rendered first aid as forced aid. One challenge with any booming drug enterprise is hiding the profits, since the trade is largely cash-based. Conservative estimates put the Kinahan turnover in the tens of millions of dollars annually. While Pablo Escobar famously buried his fortune in the ground, Kinahan Sr. invested. He set up dozens of legitimate businesses in real estate, automotive sales, and food exports to absorb excess cash. He purchased property in Belgium, where he lived periodically, and registered companies in Cyprus. Some enterprises served a dual purpose. An EU-funded transcrime report noted that a food import-export company in Ireland was used to bring drugs from Spain. Spanish police initially did little to curb the Kinahans. An Irish police source said his Spanish counterparts seemed uninterested, reasoning, "We have every sort of mafia here, and the Irish guys keep their heads down." But violence eventually demanded attention. In 2008, Paddy Doyle, a muscular enforcer recently aligned with the Kinahans, was assassinated in Estepona. He was in a BMW driven by Gary Hutch when a gunman opened fire, causing a crash. Doyle was then executed at point-blank range. Hutch escaped. Newspapers suggested Doyle died over a dispute with Russian gangsters, but Spanish police believed the Kinahans ordered the hit because they felt he'd betrayed them. Chillingly, rumors claimed Gary Hutch helped set up his friend as a show of loyalty, though he still served as a pallbearer at Doyle's funeral. Doyle's death spurred Operation Shovel, a sweeping investigation in which Spanish law enforcement worked with partners from Ireland and the UK. In May 2010, coordinated dawn raids across Spain, Ireland and Britain led to the arrests of Kinahan Sr., his sons and more than 30 alleged associates. In a BBC documentary, a Spanish officer recalled that Daniel was a little uncooperative, not a nice person at all, whereas Kinahan Sr. politely told officers they needn't have smashed his door. If they'd rung, he would have let them in. Authorities froze about 180 bank accounts linked to the organization and seized dozens of Costa del Sol properties. They uncovered not just a network ferrying cocaine from South America to European ports, but also a sophisticated money laundering operation worth hundreds of millions of euros. Investigators found that the Kinahans offered laundering services to other criminals for hefty fees. The agencies involved proclaimed victory. The head of Britain's Serious Organised Crime Agency called it a major blow, and Ireland's Justice Minister, Dermot Ahern, declared that no border would shield those involved in organised crime. The Kinahans soon tested that confidence. Despite 2 years of surveillance, Spanish authorities couldn't gather enough evidence to prosecute the family for trafficking, and after a few months in detention, Kinahan Sr., his sons and their closest associates were released without charges. Minor players faced convictions for passport fraud or gun offences, but the core leadership walked free. Even so, Operation Shovel changed the gang's dynamics. Power shifted toward Daniel, partly because his father was extradited to Belgium on money laundering charges. Unable to prove legitimate income for his casino and other ventures there, Kinahan Sr. served 2 years and lost assets worth about €2.5 million. Meanwhile, Daniel built the network of criminals, many Dutch residents, that would become the super cartel. Chris Urban, who investigated European drug gangs for the DEA until 2022, said the agency found the Kinahan group unusually hard to penetrate. In many transatlantic networks there are weak links to exploit, but after Operation Shovel, the Kinahans grew extremely cautious, switching to private encrypted phone systems and, as Spanish police would discover, showing merciless treatment of informants. Urban recalled efforts to plant a source within the organization. Gradually, intelligence emerged revealing that the Kinahans and their partners invested jointly in cocaine shipments to European ports, sharing profits to reduce risk if a shipment was seized. Only a few groups collaborated like this, he noted. The most successful traffickers were those who formed alliances. As the business ballooned, the family sought new channels to launder money. One was Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Lebanese militia, which by then was active in the cocaine trade, especially in the Netherlands, where the huge port of Rotterdam provided countless hiding places in shipping containers. Former DEA agent Jack Kelly, who specialized in tracking links between Iran-aligned groups and organized crime, noted that Hezbollah excelled at logistics and money laundering. Anyone wanting a guaranteed flow of funds back to Latin America went through Hezbollah. Kelly said the Kinahans often worked with a senior Hezbollah operative he called the Ghost, introduced through a Dutch criminal nicknamed Mink Kok. The relationship became so close that in 2015 the Irish group arranged a favor: the assassination of Mohammad Reza Kolahi, a 56-year-old Iranian electrician living under a false identity in the Dutch town of Almere. Tehran believed that Kolahi, then a student and member of an Iranian opposition group, had planted a bomb at the Islamic Republican Party headquarters in 1981, killing 73 people, and had sentenced him to death in absentia. The link between the Kinahans and Kolahi's murder wasn't obvious at first, but a few months later, Irish police searched a Dublin flat tied to the gang and found Naouf El-Fassi, a rotund Dutch-Moroccan gangster dubbed the Belly. He spoke broken English, carried 2 fake IDs and wore a watch worth tens of thousands of dollars. Later, Dutch police decrypted emails sent by Fassi. In one, he offered a gunman a nice job and quoted €130,000 as the price for killing Kolahi. Kelly believes Hezbollah commissioned the hit and the Kinahans outsourced it to Fassi, who subsequently attended Daniel's wedding. Despite their global connections, the Kinahans couldn't escape their origins in Dublin's violent feuds. After Operation Shovel, their alliance with the Hutch family deteriorated, partly because the Kinahans suspected Gary Hutch of informing for Spanish police. Graffiti reading "Gary Hutch, you rat" appeared in Dublin in 2014. Gary's uncle Jerry brokered a peace meeting where his nephew agreed to pay the Kinahans €200,000 to make amends for, among other things, shooting a Kinahan associate. Gary's brother also submitted to a punishment shooting and was shot in the leg. it didn't satisfy the Kinahans. In September 2015, Gary was murdered outside his home in Marbella. Gerry Hutch has since become more of a public figure. In 2024, he narrowly lost a bid for a seat in Ireland's lower house of parliament, the Dáil. He declined to speak for this story but recently said on a podcast that Gary's murder involved the devil, adding that it was obvious who was responsible. The feud continued. On February 5, 2016, Daniel and other Kinahan leaders were attending a boxing weigh-in at Dublin's Regency Hotel when men dressed as Garda burst in and opened fire with AK-47s. Another gunman, Kevin Murray, nicknamed Flatcap, made no attempt to conceal his identity. Murray suffered from motor neuron disease and reportedly took the job for a shipping container of cigarettes, 20,000 packs. He died from his illness 18 months later. Police believe Daniel was the intended target. He escaped through a window, but his lieutenant David Byrne was killed. Investigator Noel Brown likened the attack to the shock of journalist Veronica Guerin's murder, noting that heavily armed men were marauding through Dublin on a Friday afternoon, a scene more typical of Mexico. The Kinahans struck back quickly. 3 days later, Eddie Hutch, Gerry's brother and Gary's uncle, was shot dead at home. Over the following months, about a dozen people linked to the Hutch gang were killed. In August 2016, Trevor O'Neill, a 41-year-old Dublin city worker with no criminal ties, was mistakenly identified as a Hutch associate and shot dead while vacationing in Mallorca. Daniel's response, Brown said, reflected unrestrained fury. Though he had become a high-status criminal by 2016, Brown viewed him as the same vindictive upstart from the Oliver Bond flats, intent on killing everyone associated with the Hutches and describing them all as rats. Despite the carnage, Garda investigators made headway. In 2017, they got word that the Kinahans had hired Imre Arakas, an Estonian hitman nicknamed the Butcher, to kill James Gately, a Hutch associate living in Belfast. Irish police tailed Arakas after he landed at Dublin airport and soon arrested him at a Kinahan safe house. A BlackBerry next to him showed a series of messages among handles named Knife, Bon 4 and Bon New. Knife was Sean McGovern, a senior Kinahan lieutenant. Both Bon 4 and Bon New were Daniel. They were communicating via a private server called Secret Black Mars. The messages discussed plans to shoot Gately in the head from a distance. Later, Bon 4 proposed using a tracker on Gately's car to ambush him as he parked in his usual spot. Knowing these texts could be remotely wiped, a police officer quickly photographed the screen. Sure enough, the messages began disappearing moments later. During the Hutch feud, Garda arrested many Kinahan associates. About 80 have since been convicted. But despite incriminating evidence against Daniel and other leaders, those figures operated from afar, geographically distant in Dubai and technologically removed through encryption. Like other wealthy criminals, the Kinahans had decamped to the Emirates. Daniel Kinahan has long been enamored of boxing. He met middleweight Matthew Macklin in 2006 after Macklin narrowly lost a big fight to Jamie Moore. They became close. Kinahan later called Macklin his best friend, and in 2012 they opened a gym in Marbella. The facility and its management company were originally named MGM for Macklin's Gym Marbella, but after a dispute with the Las Vegas resort of the same initials, they rebranded as MTK Global, short for Mac the Knife. Macklin, now a Sky Sports commentator, declined to be interviewed. The gym genuinely trained fighters and quickly built a roster, but it also provided a discreet meeting space for the cartel. Many boxers who joined MTK speak highly of Kinahan. He paid more than rival managers and housed fighters comfortably. Some fighters outside the stable praised him publicly. In 2021, British boxer Amir Khan tweeted that he had huge respect for what Kinahan was doing for boxing, saying the sport needed people like Dan. Other managers, however, accused him of using illicit funds to poach talent. Kinahan's love of boxing also offered him a reputational shield. In February 2017, MTK announced that he had severed ties, yet he continued to advise fighters and broker major bouts. Around the time the family moved to Dubai, MTK opened a gym and office there. While the boxing business and the criminal enterprise were mostly separate, there was overlap. A visitor from the boxing world recalled Kinahan showing off his offices on an entire floor of a skyscraper near the Burj Khalifa. The space housed boxing operations, real estate ventures, and a freight shipping area decorated with images of 20-foot containers, the type often used to conceal cocaine. Fighters were sometimes paid in cryptocurrency, a mainstay of the Kinahans' laundering schemes. A colleague from that period remembered seeing Rafael Imperiale and Ridwan Taghi drop by while fighters breakfasted at Grosvenor House Hotel. Kinahan's reputation wasn't hidden. He had a distinctive phlegmy cough, and a trainer joked that it sounded like he was trying to get the murders out. After the US sanctions were announced, MTK Global shut down. A Dubai-based firm called Probellum then began representing many of its former fighters. In 2022, a Pakistani politician tweeted after meeting Kinahan in Dubai, saying he looked forward to hosting him in Lahore to discuss an international boxing event and suggesting Kinahan was running Probellum. The post included photos of them together. Probellum denied any connection to Kinahan, but folded several months later. Observers say Kinahan's sway over boxing persists through proxies. Anthony "Anto" Fitzpatrick, a co-founder of the Marbella gym arrested during Operation Shovel, still manages fighters. Recently, former light welterweight champion Chantelle Cameron publicly thanked him for management help. Fitzpatrick lived rent-free in a Kinahan-owned Dublin home until 2019, when the Criminal Assets Bureau seized it. Journalist Kieran Cunningham has questioned why boxing continues to welcome those linked to Kinahan. He said the sport would never allow someone like Kinahan to gain such power in any other context, yet nothing has been done to prevent a repeat. Professional boxing, Cunningham argued, continues to do business with close associates like Fitzpatrick because it simply doesn't care. A recent lawsuit illustrates just how influential Kinahan remained in boxing after claiming to step back. Manager Billy Keane, once associated with Top Rank, a promotion company founded by Bob Arum, is suing the firm, alleging it owes him money. In a California complaint filed this year, Keane described multiple meetings in Dubai, where he negotiated with Kinahan on Top Rank's behalf. At the end of 2018, Top Rank sought to sign Tyson Fury, who had returned from a hiatus marked by drug use and weight gain. Fury's draw was rekindled after an epic bout with Deontay Wilder that ended in a draw. According to Keane's complaint, Top Rank president Todd Duboff dispatched him to Dubai in January 2019 to negotiate with Kinahan, who was acting as Fury's paid advisor. Kinahan was willing for Fury to sign so long as Top Rank paid him a percentage of Fury's purses and granted MTK an output deal to ensure his other fighters got television exposure. This contradicted MTK's 2017 assertion that it had cut ties with Kinahan. Top Rank and Duboff dispute the account. Fury did not respond to inquiries. Keane said Duboff insisted Kinahan's involvement be kept secret, particularly from ESPN, which had a television deal with Top Rank because Irish media reported Kinahan headed a drug cartel. Duboff had long known Kinahan and apparently admired his fearsome reputation. 2 years earlier, when Top Rank signed MTK boxer Michael Conlan, Duboff wanted MMA star Conor McGregor to accompany Conlan to the ring. McGregor hesitated, but Duboff allegedly boasted that he had Kinahan lean on McGregor. On fight night, McGregor led Conlan out. Duboff denies involving Kinahan, though a source at MTK confirmed the story. McGregor did not respond. Talks with Kinahan resumed, but discussions hit a snag when Fury demanded ESPN guarantee his contract, doubting Top Rank's ability to pay. Duboff balked at the idea of asking the network for such assurances, so Keane suggested that Kinahan personally guarantee the contract. According to the complaint, Kinahan offered to do so, covering a multi-million-dollar deal, and Duboff agreed, replying, "Now that makes sense." Fury signed with Top Rank in February 2019. The contract reportedly stipulated that 10% of each fight purse, about $1 million per bout, would go to Kinahan via a company based in the same office as MTK. Duboff also entered a consultancy deal with Kinahan worth more than $2 million. Someone familiar with the meetings noted that Kinahan arrived at Dubai hotels with no visible security and used a regular phone and WhatsApp to arrange appointments. He projected the image of a legitimate businessman, though if someone failed to return his call promptly, he took it personally, becoming paranoid and angry. By then, Kinahan was effectively a boxing kingmaker. In 2020, a year after signing with Top Rank, Fury posted a video announcing that he'd agreed to fight Anthony Joshua in a 2-bout deal for the heavyweight championship. Curiously, Joshua owns a company, 258 Investments, that previously operated as MTK Property Investments, sharing its name with Kinahan's brand. A spokesperson said Joshua had never done business with Kinahan and claimed the initials stood for Money Through Knockouts. Joshua has visited the Marbella gym, and a Kinahan source said he once considered joining MTK. Joshua's publicist did not issue a denial when asked about negotiations. In the video, Fury thanked Kinahan 3 times for securing the deal. Kinahan is known to control his social media appearances closely. A publicist advised him to ask Fury for recognition. But the video backfired. Chris Urban recalled that law enforcement officials were stunned, describing it as a tipping point. Seeing a major star like Tyson Fury publicly endorse a man described by authorities as a drug boss was astonishing. Urban remembered thinking, "This cannot happen. This has got to stop." Just before Fury signed with Top Rank, French police executed a search warrant at a data center in Roubaix to secretly copy servers belonging to EncroChat, an encrypted phone network used mainly by criminals. In April 2020, they installed malware on EncroChat devices that allowed them to read stored and real-time messages. EncroChat shut down in July 2020, and thousands of arrests followed across Europe. Another encrypted network, Sky ECC, had even more users. Its servers were also in Roubaix and were similarly hacked in 2021. For 3 weeks, authorities could read all Sky ECC messages live. These EncroChat and Sky ECC operations represented one of the biggest breakthroughs in European policing in decades. A Dutch police chief likened it to sitting at the criminals' table and led to the arrests of several super cartel figures. Europol analysts sifted through the intercepted chats. In The Hague, officers, who declined to be named, explained that the first cartel member they identified was Sean McGovern, who discussed a rap video on EncroChat. Cross-referencing the conversation revealed the wider network in Spain and Dubai. One surprising aspect was that Daniel wasn't on these encrypted channels. His lieutenants referred to the big guy, or used his nickname, Chess, and noted he didn't carry an encrypted phone. Messages for him were relayed by deputies who took twice-weekly walks with him. The analysts concluded that McGovern, still using the secret Black Mars handle knife, was a main conduit to Daniel. Others recalled McGovern distributing fresh encrypted devices to lieutenants at the Dubai gym. No other cartel leader exercised such caution. One analyst said only Kinahan seemed smart enough to stay off the networks. The chat suggested the Kinahans were bringing drugs into Spain through the port of Valencia, hidden among shipments of coffee, beer and machinery. From Spain, the loads travelled by truck to the Netherlands and then onto Ireland and the UK. The consignments came directly from Brazil, Costa Rica and Panama. In code, the Irish referred to cocaine as bits and cannabis as jackets. Daniel's brother, using the handle Mano, sometimes messaged about asking Daniel to send money to pay staff at their gyms. One photo in the chats showed a huge block of cocaine. Overall, the messages documented the group's participation in multi-ton shipments involving several investors. Irish police long regarded Kinahan Sr. as subtler than his eldest son. Noel Brown observed that the father would never have become entangled with boxing or high-profile fighters like Tyson Fury. He was too strategic. Daniel, by contrast, relished notoriety and strutting around in the spotlight. Beyond boxing, Daniel attempted to refurbish his image clumsily. In 2019, production began on a 15-minute film titled Regency: Discover the Truth, Daniel Kinahan. The movie offered a conspiratorial take on the AK-47 attack at the Regency Hotel, baselessly accusing police and politicians of involvement. It employed dozens of actors and extras, boasted unexpectedly high production values, and was directed by Welsh filmmaker Caradog James, whose work had been screened at the Tribeca Film Festival. James declined to comment. Emails reviewed by reporters confirmed what was obvious. Kinahan financed the film but tried to hide his role. The company behind it, Nasmo Productions, was run by a business partner of Ali Shams-Poor, a British entrepreneur later involved with Probellum. Nasmo folded after the film aired, leaving debts of about $200,000, likely close to the film's cost. Poor, who had produced 2 of James's features, had been Kinahan's neighbour in Dubai. The film proved a futile vanity project. When it appeared on YouTube in 2020, it was swiftly removed after a news outlet complained about unauthorized use of its material. Though it occasionally resurfaces online, most viewers dismiss it as propaganda. One commenter joked that it must have been directed by Daniel himself. In 2022, Kinahan recorded a 3-hour interview with Scottish podcaster James English to tell his side of the story. In a promotional trailer, he said he wasn't an angel, but was proud of where he came from and what he'd built. The episode never aired because of legal issues, though English has interviewed Marvin Herbert, a reformed gangster who lauded Kinahan and said he admired him more than any other man he'd met. Even Christy Kinahan Sr., now in his late 60s, has occasionally behaved with naivety. For a time, he maintained a LinkedIn profile claiming to be a senior consultant in the aviation sector with degrees from the Open University and regularly posted on Twitter praising Vladimir Putin and spreading anti-vaccine theories. Those profiles were removed in 2022. In 2024, Bellingcat published a colorful investigation showing he had left hundreds of digital traces under his first and middle names, Christopher Vincent. They included dozens of restaurant reviews. In one, he praised a Dubai cafe for its acai bowl, eggs with almond bread and green salad, writing that the meal was well presented and rating the place 5 stars. The online trail highlighted more than culinary taste. It revealed how freely Kinahan Sr. traveled. Some reviews were from Zimbabwe, where police believe he tried to settle, though the government reportedly denied him residency. Another review was from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Documents obtained by Malawi's Platform for Investigative Journalism and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists show that in 2019, Kinahan Sr. attended an aviation conference there to try to buy military aircraft. In an email, he wrote that he wanted to create a smoke and mirrors illusion to position a company for aircraft financing. A linked firm later tried to buy up to 9 Egyptian Air Force planes for around $8 million. Britain's Sunday Times reported that security services suspected he intended to acquire the aircraft for Iranian interests or sublease them to Iranian airlines. The deal fell apart. The newspaper also reported that Kinahan Sr. used Zimbabwe as a base for a laundering scheme exploiting the country's loosely regulated gold market. The operation allegedly involved stuffing euro and sterling notes into car doors, transporting them to Mozambican and Namibian ports, exchanging the cash on Zimbabwe's black market, and buying gold that was then shipped to Dubai and sold, returning the money to the legitimate economy. According to Bellingcat, Kinahan Sr.'s globe-trotting effectively ceased in April 2022 when US Ambassador to Ireland Claire Cronin announced sanctions against the family's crime group. Standing alongside Garda, Europol, Britain's National Crime Agency, and the DEA, she offered a $5 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Christie Sr., Christie Jr., or Daniel. She vowed that the United States would bring their leaders to justice wherever they were. US Treasury sanctions against European organized crime groups are rare. The decision was particularly notable given there was no direct evidence that the Kinahans shipped drugs to America, though some officials suspect the gang invested in a huge cocaine shipment seized in Philadelphia in 2019 en route to Northern Europe. The Treasury, sources said, was moved by the gang's scale, reach, and notoriety, and by signs that its financial tentacles stretched into the US. The most visible tentacle, of course, wore boxing gloves. Sanctions have constrained the Kinahans' freedom, but not stifled Christie Sr.'s urge to post reviews. 6 months after they were imposed, he wrote a 5-star review of a fishing trip in the UAE, praising an excursion with friends and boasting that they caught a cartload of fish. Rafael Imperiale, the super cartel member deported to Italy, was arrested in Dubai in July 2021, largely due to evidence from the Sky ECC hack. He is now held at Rebibbia prison near Rome. In 2023 and 2024, he frequently met with Maurizio De Marco, an anti-mafia prosecutor from Naples with a grey goatee and an easy manner, who persuaded him to turn pentito, or state's witness, in exchange for leniency. Since then, De Marco has travelled by armoured truck to the prison roughly 50 times, gathering around 3,000 pages of testimony detailing murders, multi-ton cocaine shipments and gang feuds. De Marco's office is heavily guarded. When reporters visited, he said he couldn't divulge everything about the ongoing investigations into the Kinahans, but shared insights about Imperial's relationships with imprisoned cartel members. He read some of Imperial's comments. Imperial said Daniel Kinahan was his dearest friend and fellow boxing enthusiast and recalled attending his wedding. However, he added that because Daniel was close to Ricardo Riquelme, he wouldn't make deals with Daniel without including Riquelme. A more extensive section of Imperiale's testimony offered perhaps the clearest view yet of the super cartel. He explained it wasn't a single entity, but a loose confederation of criminals who partnered on specific ventures and then went their separate ways. "We're all dependent on each other, but also competitors," he said. "Sometimes we're business partners, and then our paths separate again." The group's origins were in the Netherlands rather than Dubai. Imperiale met Riquelme in Amsterdam in 2008 after the Chilean left a German prison. They occasionally trained at a Thai boxing gym and later collaborated on a shipment of 300 kilos of cocaine. During another interview, Imperiale recounted that Riquelme once planned to kill a criminal rival. The plan was for ninjas, a code word for cartel-connected Colombian hit teams, to fly to Dubai and carry out the murder. The hit was ultimately cancelled partly because Dubai was difficult terrain for such operations and partly because, as Imperiale quoted the Irish faction, "You shouldn't commit murders in Dubai. We live here. Our children are here. This is a neutral country." Daniel did not want blood spilled there, and his voice carried weight. Though Imperiale may have agreed about keeping Dubai violence-free, he freely admitted to wanting rivals dead, saying everyone quietly digs a pit for the others. After the US sanctions were announced, rumours circulated that the Kinahans might leave the Emirates, but Irish police told reporters that Dubai remained their sanctuary. That summer, members of the family were spotted by rivals in the city, and a source said a friend had bumped into Daniel at a shopping mall. In 2022, US authorities said Daniel was renting a luxurious apartment on Palm Jumeirah, a man-made island shaped like a palm tree where celebrities like David and Victoria Beckham have owned homes. He has since moved elsewhere in Dubai. Police sources say the Kinahans favour flashy cars and patronise VIP Motors, a dealership that stocks vehicles like a $3.5 million Bugatti Chiron. Someone who met Daniel shortly before sanctions noted he had also splurged on a hair transplant. Karen Greenaway, a retired FBI agent who specialised in illicit finances and has written about Dubai's role in fostering corruption, explained that the first criminal groups to settle in the Emirates were Russian gangs in the early 2000s. Others followed, attracted by the warm climate and lax oversight. Imperiale moved there in 2010 after operating from Spain. Spanish prosecutors sought his extradition from the UAE in 2014, but authorities ignored the request. In 2015, Italy indicted him for drug trafficking and likewise asked for extradition, but the UAE again declined. He lived openly in Dubai for 6 more years, masquerading as a real estate investor. Greenaway said Dubai historically hasn't cared about reputation so long as crimes aren't committed locally. Hardened criminals could bring in money, invest in real estate, use the gold market and other mechanisms to launder cash without interference. The Kinahans have leveraged these systems. Europol reports that they used a Dubai Hawala network, a trust-based, untraceable money transfer system often employed for laundering. Daniel and his brother purchased expensive properties and incorporated multiple companies in the UAE. Emirati regulators seem to have conducted only cursory checks, deeming the brothers low risk. Just before the US sanctions, the G7's Financial Action Task Force placed the UAE on its grey list of jurisdictions deficient in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures. The Emirates were removed from the list in 2024. US Treasury documents sanctioning the Kinahans describe Dubai as a facilitation hub for illicit activity. The UAE later announced it had frozen all assets tied to the Kinahans, yet the family has circumvented the measures. Daniel's wife, Kiva Robinson, who is not sanctioned, has sold millions of dollars worth of property since April 2022. Leaked property data shows she bought a home in the gated Emirates Hills for $7 million in 2020 and sold it 3 years later for $14 million. Imperiale's testimony also suggested that cartel members paid bribes to Emirati officials. He said Dubai police officers extorted drug traffickers, stopping them as they entered the country and demanding millions of euros to let them pass. The Kinahans may not always have needed outright bribery. For a time, MTK Global employed Khalid Al-Jasmi, a graduate of Dubai's police academy who spent more than 2 decades in government as its brand ambassador. An associate told reporters that Al-Jasmi was instrumental in handling business licensing and political introductions for Kinahan in Dubai. Evidence hints that even the UAE's ruling elite have ties to criminal enterprises. In 2015, Sheikh Marwan bin Mohammed Al Maktoum, a son of Dubai's ruler, bought a majority stake in AA Real Estate Development, a company in which Imperiale had invested, shortly after Spain sought his extradition. Imperiale personally signed documents transferring shares to the prince. Decrypted messages indicate that Edin Gachanin secured protection in the UAE through royal associates, yet Gachanin, Imperiale and others who once considered Dubai a safe haven have been jailed. The UAE won't shield criminals if doing so conflicts with its interests. Greenaway said murder charges are most likely to prompt the Emiratis to act. If violence threatens tourism or occurs in their territory, they will expel offenders. This raises the question of whether Dubai will ever rid itself of the Kinahans. That prospect seems more plausible now. In April 2022, Ireland's High Court issued a European arrest warrant for Sean McGovern on charges of directing a criminal organisation and murdering Noel Duck Egg Kerwin in 2016 during the Hutch-Kinahan feud. Despite the gravity of the accusations and an Interpol red notice, it took more than 2 years to persuade Emirati authorities to act. In October 2024, McGovern was arrested at his Dubai home. He clearly hadn't anticipated danger. He was extradited in May and now sits in Port Louis prison. His trial is expected to begin next year. McGovern's extradition has fueled speculation that the Kinahans might relocate to more accommodating jurisdictions, perhaps Russia or Iran. Developments in the UAE suggest their position is fragile. In September, Dubai police arrested 4 Scottish men alleged to be major criminals without waiting for Scotland's assistance. 3 have since been released. Garda Commissioner Justin Kelly said he was encouraged that Emirati police appeared more willing to move against organised crime figures. The UAE, he noted, faces reputational risks. Daniel Kinahan may feel secure as long as he isn't charged, and an indictment from the United States seems unlikely. US priorities under the current administration focus on fentanyl and Latin American cartels. A DEA source said the agency had little interest in pursuing the Kinahans now. In Ireland, prosecutors have 2 case files on Daniel, one alleging he directed a criminal organisation, the other accusing him of ordering Eddie Hutch's murder 3 days after the Regency attack. The files have sat for 18 months, frustrating Garda. Until charges are filed, Dubai police are unlikely to knock on his door. Kelly said the $5 million reward remains on offer, open even to Kinahan associates, and nothing is off the table. On September 26, 2023, Irish Army Rangers fast-roped onto the freighter MV Matthew south of Cork and arrested the crew as they tried to burn more than 2 tons of cocaine. Garda believed the smuggling venture was co-organised and financed by the Kinahans, Colombia's Clan del Golfo and Hezbollah operatives in Venezuela. In the special criminal court, testimony indicated that a Dutch crew member, Kumali Ozgun, acted as the operation's eyes and ears. The mission was directed from Dubai. One detective testified that this criminal alliance had immense capabilities and unlimited resources. In court, investigators revealed that the MV Matthew was owned by Symphony Marine, a shipping company registered in the Emirates. Dubai's business registry lists no ultimate owner or even a name for the company. It was registered using a single email address. That address belongs to Jacob Joseph, a UAE shipping broker who initially denied any knowledge of Symphony Marine's fleet. In further exchanges, Joseph said he previously worked for Global Shipping Group, another Emirati company, and had signed for 3 tankers sanctioned for carrying Iranian crude oil. He claimed his email was used on Symphony Marine documents without consent and asserted that the real owners of both Global Shipping and Symphony Marine were from Iran. This link suggests the Kinahans remain aligned with geopolitical pariahs. It also raises a psychological question. Despite tightening nets, why do they continue smuggling vast quantities of drugs when money should no longer be a pressing need? Michael O'Sullivan, who has spent decades tracking the family, from Christie Sr.'s heroin dealing to their cocaine empire and the Hutch-Kinahan bloodshed, pondered this. He recalled monitoring ships carrying Kinahan drugs to Europe and, when asked why they hadn't slowed down, responded that in 45 years of law enforcement, he'd learned that a leopard doesn't change its spots. He never expected them to become carpenters or electricians. Nothing has changed, he said. Still, some things do evolve. Daniel is thought to have at least 6 children with 3 women. 2 of his sons, Sean and Kian, are in their 20s and share his interests. When Tyson Fury fought Alexander Usyk in Riyadh in May 2024, a reporter sitting near the ring noticed a young man a few rows away wearing a black t-shirt and beaming. It was Kian Kinahan.
In this true crime documentary, we will cover the rise and fall of Philip Barron, a man who presented himself as a respectable businessman on the edge of Dublin's elite. He had never been known to police in Ireland, not by reputation, not by arrest record, not even by rumour. To his neighbours in Straffan, County Kildare, he was a foreign property investor, a family man, and the owner of a lucrative deck chair rental business in Spain. Yet by 2013, investigators in Britain and Ireland concluded that Barron had been responsible for importing more than 52 tons of cocaine and cannabis into the United Kingdom and Ireland. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment so you don't miss future true crime stories. The case against him did not begin with violence or betrayal, but with paperwork. Between 2005 and 2009, Barron's associates logged shipments as if they were entries in a shipping company ledger: dates, weights, profits, losses. One consignment seized at a British port was marked down simply as damaged cargo. Another, intercepted in Spain, was treated as a routine business setback. Investigators later found that 89 people were arrested over the course of the 5-year inquiry before Barron himself was charged. He was known by the handle 4X, a nickname earned from his fondness for Range Rovers. He lived beside the K Club golf resort, an estate synonymous with Ireland's wealthy elite, where his children attended private school and his wife Elaine wore a €200,000 diamond ring. But the same records that tracked profits for lavish parties and first-class travel also showed a €2,000 allocation for a Manchester United suite booked for his son's 18th birthday. It was an empire disguised as a household budget. Barron's network was unusual for its time. It did not rely on concealment in car panels or fishing trawlers. Instead, it relied on the logistics industry itself. Beginning in the mid-2000s, his associates rented a chain of 12 virtual offices across the United Kingdom, from Glasgow to Cardiff, from Birmingham to Cheltenham. These offices were not workplaces in any real sense. They existed to receive deliveries. Packages labelled as technical manuals or automotive brochures arrived by mainstream international couriers. Each package contained cannabis or cocaine, sourced through Colombian suppliers and routed through Spain. Once delivered, another member of the syndicate collected the consignment and arranged local distribution. The shipments were large. In November 2008, Barron flew to Costa Rica to finalise a deal. Weeks later, investigators in Spain found cocaine of 83% purity, far above the street-level average of under 10%, hidden in freight bound for the UK. By then, Barron and his partner, Walter Callanan, had overseen consignments worth an estimated €350 million. The operation was structured like a corporation. Callanan, nicknamed Big Fella, maintained the ledgers from his villa in Malaga. Malcolm Carl, a former Barclays information technology employee, acted as money launderer. Profits were divided like shareholder dividends. Even losses were absorbed without panic. This was essentially a group of businessmen who became drug dealers, one investigator later remarked. Barron maintained the outward image of success. He attended black-tie dinners in Dublin, played golf at the K Club, and travelled first class to watch the Ashes. His children mixed with bankers and socialites. To outsiders, the source of wealth was never questioned. To insiders, he was a key contact with Colombian cartels and Irish traffickers alike, a man who bridged continents while living undisturbed in suburban Kildare. By 2009, surveillance teams had begun to close in. The serious organised crime agency in Britain, working with Gardaí in Ireland and police in Spain, had already intercepted dozens of phone calls. Barron and his associates spoke only in code. Dates became meetings, consignments became boxes, and cocaine was simply the white stuff. Yet the language was consistent. Over time, investigators were able to match coded conversations with seizures logged in the gang's own financial records. Other calls drew a clearer line. Barron was recorded advising an associate to destroy mobile phones linked to the Irish Mafia in Spain, an organisation run by Christy Kinahan, known to police as the Dapper Don. The cooperation between the two networks was evident. Barron dealt directly with Colombian suppliers. Kinahan's cartel controlled distribution across Ireland. Together, they facilitated shipments on a scale rarely seen in Western Europe. Barron himself was careful. He avoided direct contact with street-level dealers and rarely used the same phone for more than a few weeks. He maintained the image of a well-educated English businessman who had settled comfortably in Kildare, but the people around him left traces. In Cheltenham, staff at an office services company noticed an unusual volume of parcels addressed to their location and alerted authorities. In Spain, raids on Callanan's property uncovered a 200-page ledger that detailed consignments of cannabis over 17 months, records that alone accounted for 6% of all cannabis entering Britain at the time. It was the ledgers, combined with the intercepted calls, that shifted suspicion into certainty. The investigation, codenamed Operation Beath, had begun to dismantle one of Britain's 10 largest trafficking syndicates. What remained was to target the man who lived quietly behind the gates of a Strafford mansion. While Barron's Irish family lived in comfort, his estranged daughter in Manchester experienced a different reality. Rachel was contacted by her father after years of silence, shortly after the birth of her child. At first, the renewed contact appeared paternal. In practice, it became a means of exploitation. Rachel was asked to pay bills with his American Express card, to purchase cars in his name, and to collect cash on his behalf. One transaction involved a €100,000 Bentley convertible, another a Range Rover. Rachel was later convicted of laundering £1 million of drugs money and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The court accepted that she had been manipulated. At the same time, Barron's wife Elaine and their 2 Irish children, Nicola and Philip Jr., were surrounded by privilege. They attended the prestigious King's Hospital School in Dublin, kept horses, and appeared in gossip columns alongside bankers' children and socialites. Neighbours believed Barron's fortune came from deck chairs on Spanish beaches, or perhaps olive oil. The truth was never suspected. They hosted friends from the Mansfield family, whose own wealth and social ties cemented the impression of legitimacy. "We thought he was an oil baron, not a drugs baron," one local remarked after his arrest. The contrast with Rachel's situation was stark. While she survived on benefits and accepted crumbs from the criminal proceeds, the Strafford household enjoyed the full scope of Barron's hidden empire. It was this duality, lavish respectability in Ireland and exploitation in England, that defined the paradox of Philip Barron's criminal career. On a morning in May 2011, unmarked Garda cars converged on Bourne-Ogues, the cul-de-sac in Strafford where Barron lived. The detached 5-bedroom house, with paddocks stretching toward the K-Club golf course, had given little indication of what was about to unfold. Officers detained Barron under a European arrest warrant obtained by British authorities. He confirmed his identity but offered no comment on the charges. The case centred on conspiracy to import cocaine and cannabis, worth more than €13 million between 2005 and 2009. British prosecutors alleged that Barron had sourced consignments in South Africa and Costa Rica, routed them through Spain, and directed their final transport to the United Kingdom. By then, 7 members of his network had already been jailed for more than 100 years in combined sentences. Extradition proceedings began in Dublin's High Court. Barron's defence argued that he faced disproportionate punishment in the UK and sought to block removal on human rights grounds. For 18 months, hearings and appeals moved slowly through the courts. Elaine, his wife, sold a €250,000 ring to cover legal costs. At one stage, Barron was reported to have told a family member in prison, "The evidence is so strong that not even the Pope could get out of it." In late 2012, Ireland's Supreme Court dismissed his final appeal. In December, he was placed on a flight to Liverpool under Garda escort. For investigators who had tracked him across 3 countries, the extradition closed a long chapter of delay. For Barron, it marked the beginning of proceedings in a British courtroom where his double life, as businessman and trafficker, would be examined in detail. In May 2013, Philip Barron stood in the dock at Liverpool Crown Court. He was 57 years old, formally dressed, and facing 3 principal counts: conspiracy to import cocaine, conspiracy to import cannabis, and money laundering. Prosecutors described him as one of the organisers of a highly sophisticated criminal enterprise. The jury heard that his network had smuggled at least 52 tons of narcotics into Britain over 15 years, with an estimated street value of €350 million. The evidence was extensive: financial logs and ledgers, seized in raids across Spain and the United Kingdom, recorded consignments in meticulous detail, quantities, dates, and profits. Intercepted phone calls captured Barron issuing coded instructions that matched those records precisely. In one instance, he arranged a delivery disguised as a consignment of technical manuals. In another, he advised an associate to destroy phones linked to the Kinahan organisation in Spain. Judge David Aubrey addressed him directly at sentencing. "It was a trade and an empire, and you cared not for the lives of others," he said. "You were only concerned with yourself and leading a lavish lifestyle." The court was told that Barron had sourced cocaine of unusually high purity, 83%, after a trip to Costa Rica in 2008. By comparison, street-level seizures rarely exceeded 10%. The outcome was decisive. Barron received a sentence of 18 years imprisonment. His co-defendants, including Walter Callanan and Malcolm Carl, were also jailed for lengthy terms. For British and Irish investigators, Operation Beath had reached its conclusion. One of the top 10 smuggling networks ever uncovered in the United Kingdom had been dismantled. For Barron's family, the verdict ended the illusion of deck-chair empires and olive oil fortunes. The source of their wealth was now a matter of public record. After sentencing, attention shifted from the courtroom to the money. Investigators from the Serious Organised Crime Agency had traced millions through offshore accounts and suspected trusts in Eastern Europe. Records pointed to assets in Switzerland and Uzbekistan, along with yachts, racehorses and properties purchased during the boom years. Trust funds were said to exist in the names of Barron's children, Nicola and Philip Jr., though both denied knowledge or involvement. In Straffan, the family presented a different image. Elaine, once seen driving a Range Rover and wearing a €200,000 solitaire ring, was reported to be running a small hair salon in Naas, charging €20 for blow-dries. Nicola, a regular on the Dublin party circuit, now drove a Mini Cooper. Philip Jr. told reporters, "We are broke, on our knees, we have nothing." He pointed to an aging Peugeot in the driveway of their €1 million home and remarked, "Look what my mum is driving. We have nothing. Look at us." Yet they remained behind the electric gates of Bonogues. Identical homes on the cul-de-sac were valued at close to €950,000. Their continued residence raised questions about how much of Barron's wealth had truly been stripped away. For neighbours, the revelations were disorienting. Many believed Barron's fortune came from olive oil or property investments. The idea that a drug trafficking empire had operated quietly from their village was a shock. The thought of a massive drug empire never crossed our minds. As the Criminal Assets Bureau and British authorities prepared further hearings to seize what remained, the family's social standing in Straffan diminished. The Celtic Tiger dream had dissolved into police raids, pawned jewellery and court-ordered asset recovery. What persisted was suspicion. Millions were still unaccounted for. Barron served just under half of his 18-year sentence before qualifying for release under standard parole rules. By the late 2000s, reports placed him back in Straffan, once again behind the gates of the house at Bonogues. His presence was quiet but unmistakable. Neighbours spoke of seeing him on the grounds, maintaining a low profile. For investigators, the question was whether the man once described as the most sophisticated trafficker in Britain had truly retired. Much of his wealth remained elusive. While official proceedings targeted cars, jewellery and bank accounts, offshore trusts and investments were harder to trace. Authorities suspected that millions had been secured for his children in accounts stretching from Switzerland to Uzbekistan. Financial intelligence units on both sides of the Irish Sea acknowledged the difficulty of dismantling wealth spread across jurisdictions and shielded by layers of ownership. The wider landscape had also shifted. During Barron's imprisonment, the Kinahan Cartel expanded across Europe, consolidating distribution routes that he once helped establish. Other networks filled the vacuum his downfall created. The techniques he employed, corporate-style ledgers, virtual offices, coded communications, became templates for newer organizations. Law enforcement adjusted in turn, focusing on financial trails as much as physical seizures. For the family, the contradictions remained. To some, they were victims of a patriarch who lived a double life. To others, they were beneficiaries of hidden fortunes. Elaine continued to insist she believed her husband's claims of legitimate business. Nicola and Philip Jr. maintained they had no role in trafficking. Rachel, his estranged daughter in Manchester, had long since served her reduced sentence. The final image is of a man returned to where his deception began, a quiet suburb of Kildare, a house beside a golf course, and a fortune only partially uncovered. Whether Philip Barron lives as a retired figure or still exerts influence is a question unanswered.
On the 7th of January 2010, a 30-year-old drug trafficker named John Paul Joyce disappeared from the North Dublin suburb of Coolock. 2 days later, his frozen body was discovered in a flooded ditch near Dublin Airport. He had been shot several times in the head. This was the first gangland killing in Ireland in 2010, a murder that remained unsolved for decades. Joyce was a member of a wealthy traveller family and a key player in one of Dublin's most notorious drug gangs. He had survived previous assassination attempts and usually wore body armour. But on the night he was killed, he wasn't wearing his bulletproof vest. His murder was the result of a violent feud between his gang and a rival crew led by one of Ireland's most dangerous criminals. But was his death an act of revenge, or did someone inside his own circle set him up? Before we begin, it's important to understand something. The term traveller refers to an indigenous ethnic minority in Ireland with deep roots and a long nomadic history. Traditionally, travellers moved from town to town trading horses, repairing tins and selling goods, a culture that valued independence and strong family loyalty. Over time, many became part of what's known as the settled traveller community, living permanently in houses or halting sites across Ireland. Members of the Joyce family were part of that settled traveller community. They operated from a halting site, essentially a trailer park, at Grove Lane near Darndale in North Dublin. Grove Lane was more than just home, it was their base of operations, where family bonds mixed with criminal enterprise. For outsiders, it looked like an ordinary traveller site. For those who knew better, it was the heart of a growing drug empire, and as the money flowed and enemies multiplied, Grove Lane became a ticking time bomb. John Paul Joyce was born in 1979. He grew up in a large traveller family at the Grove Lane halting site off the Malahide Road in Coolock. Along with his brothers Tommy and James, he built a major cocaine and cannabis distribution network. The guards called them the Joyce Brothers Gang. From their base at Grove Lane, the Joyce Gang imported wholesale quantities of cocaine and cannabis resin. They often mixed the drugs locally and supplied dealers across North Dublin. They were making serious money. In January 2008, Gardaí raided the gang during an operation they called Operation Thor. They seized €2 million worth of cocaine. They found a mixing plant for cutting the drugs. They recovered guns and ammunition. They also found a hand grenade, a sawn-off shotgun, and a samurai sword. In another raid, Gardaí recovered cocaine worth €500,000 and more firearms. John Paul Joyce was arrested, but he avoided serious convictions. The Joyce brothers used their criminal income to buy expensive vehicles and watches. When Tommy Joyce, one of the younger brothers in the gang, was only 19 years old, the Criminal Assets Bureau targeted him. This was unusual for someone so young, but not unusual for someone who was involved in the illegal drugs trade. Investigators told the High Court he belonged to a major cocaine gang. Despite having no legitimate income, he owned a Range Rover Sport and a BMW valued at more than €100,000. John Paul Joyce wore a watch worth €30,000. Gardaí seized cash and high-end vehicles from him as well. But the Joyce brothers weren't just drug dealers, they were violent enforcers. In June 2008, John Paul survived an ambush outside a fitness gym on the Malahide Road. Gunmen shot at him while he sat in his car. The gunman responsible for that attack later disappeared. He is presumed dead. John Paul also had a violent criminal record. In March 2006, he and another man attacked a random man named Connor Weldon in a pub on St. Patrick's Day. The reason for this attack, Weldon's son had accidentally spilled a drink on someone from the Joyce group. That led to a beating that almost killed the dad in a pub. According to court testimony, Weldon was kicked and stamped on. His head was repeatedly slammed by a door. He suffered severe brain damage and spent months in a coma. For this attack, Joyce was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The final year was suspended when he agreed to pay €10,000 in compensation. Joyce was released from prison in November 2009. He had served his time for the Weldon assault, but Garda intelligence indicated a €30,000 contract had been issued on his life shortly before he was freed. Gardaí warned him that his life was in danger. He frequently wore a bulletproof vest. He varied his routine to avoid assassination, but he continued to meet associates. Despite the constant threat, he resumed his involvement in the drug trade. The main enemies of the Joyce gang were based in Finglas, an area of northwest Dublin. Their leader was a man named Eamon Dunn. His nickname was The Don. Dunn had taken over the Finglas gang after having his own boss murdered in 2006. That boss was Martin Hyland, known as Marlo. Dunn's gang controlled heroin and cocaine distribution across Finglas, Cabra and Ballymun. They carried out robberies and extortion. They systematically eliminated rivals. One newspaper described Dunn as the country's most ruthless and dangerous criminal. They reported he ordered 17 killings between 2005 and his own death in April 2010. Dunn often wore body armor. He employed armed minders, yet he also killed associates on suspicion of disloyalty. His paranoia and violent enforcement drew public attention. Garda sources said his gang adopted a "get them before they get you" mentality. They were suspected in the murders of major criminals, including Marlo Hyland, Paul Martin, Michael Cronin, James Maloney, Graham McNally, Michael Murray, and David Thomas. Dunn worked closely with other gangs. This included Freddie Thompson's Dublin crew and the McCarthy-Dundon gang from Limerick. They formed alliances to source drugs and arrange contract killings. The feud between the Joyce gang and Dunn's Fingless gang escalated in 2008 and 2009. Both groups were fighting for control of drug supply in North Dublin. Dunn's gang murdered several up-and-coming dealers to maintain dominance. The Joyce brothers were also expanding their network. A clash was inevitable. John Paul Joyce survived the shooting outside the gym in June 2008. Garda sources later linked that attack to the same gunman suspected of killing two other criminals, Rolly Cronin and James Maloney. An important trigger in the feud was the killing of John Clark. He was known as BJ. He was 21 years old and a drug dealer from Darndale. Clark was described as a rapidly rising gangland figure. He had several drug convictions. He had been wounded in a shooting 6 weeks before his death. On the 7th of May 2009, Clark and two friends were ambushed in the underground car park of an apartment building in Artane. A gunman with a Scorpion machine pistol shot them. Clark was killed. His two companions were injured. The guards believed Clark was a member of a gang selling heroin and cocaine across North Dublin. He had many enemies. The Criminal Assets Bureau had already decided to target his assets. He had been warned his life was in danger. Gardaí believed one of the people who wanted Clark dead was Tommy Joyce, John Paul's younger brother. According to sources, rumours circulated that Tommy offered €40,000 and a Scorpion pistol to anyone who would kill Clark. Ballistics later showed the gun used in Clark's murder was indeed a Scorpion pistol. This fueled speculation that Tommy supplied the weapon. On the 17th of June 2009, just weeks after BJ Clark's murder, Tommy Joyce was shot 5 times outside his home at the Grove Lane halting site. He was 20 years old. Tommy Joyce was one of the youngest criminals ever targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau. He owned a Range Rover and BMW purchased with drug money. Gardaí believed his murder might have been revenge for the Clark killing. Criminals in Darndale believed Tommy owned a Scorpion pistol and had orchestrated Clark's death. Others suspected a feud with a gang from Sheriff Street might have been involved. On the 7th of January 2009, before the Joyce feud erupted, a hitman shot 2 men in the Summerhill area of Dublin. They were heroin dealer Michael Cronin, who was 35, and his driver James Maloney, who was 26. A gunman entered the back of their car under the pretense of arranging a drug deal. He fired shots at their heads, killing both men. Forensic evidence linked the murders to Christopher Gilroy. He was known as Christy. He was a heroin user and armed robber from Dorset Street. The guards believe Eamon Dunn's Fingless gang hired Gilroy to kill Cronin and Maloney. After the murders, Gilroy fled. In January 2009, as the guards searched for him, Gilroy vanished. He has never been seen again. Garda believed Dunn arranged Gilroy's murder. The hitman was an addict and was considered a liability. They suspect Dunn used contacts in Spain to have him shot and his body hidden. A later report revealed that another contract killer, Eric Wilson, known as Lucky, lured Gilroy to Spain and murdered him. He buried his body in a shallow grave. On Thursday, the 7th of January 2010, John Paul Joyce left a house on Ferry Carrig Road in Coolock around 7 in the evening. He was going to meet an associate. His family believed the meeting was for criminal business. He never returned. Joyce's partner, Leah Murphy, reported him missing 2 days later. Local guards and air support units searched Coolock, Malahide and Portmarnock the following day. On Saturday, the 9th of January 2010, people passing by Dumbro Lane noticed blood in the snow. Dumbro Lane is a quiet country road near Dublin Airport. They discovered Joyce's body. It was partly submerged in a flooded ditch. The freezing conditions suggested it had been dumped there on Thursday night. The state pathologist, Dr. Marie Cassidy, conducted a post-mortem. She revealed that Joyce had been shot several times in the head. Gardaí believe he was abducted after leaving Ferry Carrig Road. He was bundled into a vehicle and taken to Dunbro Lane. There, he was executed. At the time of his death, Joyce was under threat from multiple enemies. Garda sources said he regularly wore a bulletproof vest, but he was not wearing it on the night he disappeared. Investigators initially suspected the killing was linked to the feud with Dunn's gang. Joyce had several enemies, including major rival traffickers. One theory suggests Joyce might have been killed because he failed to dispose of a murder weapon. Dunn had instructed him to dispose of a gun used to murder another criminal named Paul Martin, but Garda recovered it. This may have prompted revenge. Another theory holds that Joyce was lured to his death by someone he trusted. According to sources, Joyce told friends he was meeting an associate that night. He was lured into a trap by a man working for the Fingless Gang. The same sources say Joyce's murder was carried out by the Fingless Gang, working with remnants of the B.J. Clark Gang. Gardaí intelligence also indicated there was a €30,000 contract on Joyce's life. This was believed to have been issued by a major West Dublin gang boss. Given his role in drug trafficking and his reputation for violence, multiple rival gangs had motive to kill him. Guards at Coolock launched a murder inquiry. They appealed for information about Joyce's last movements. They searched Ferry Carrig Road for CCTV footage. They conducted door-to-door inquiries. They interviewed his associates. However, witnesses in gangland killings rarely cooperate. The investigation quickly stalled. No one has ever been charged with Joyce's murder. The prime suspects are members of Dunn's Fingless Gang. Multiple sources explicitly state that Joyce was murdered by the Fingless Gang led by Dunn. The feud between Joyce and Dunn's gang had escalated after the murders of B.J. Clark and Tommy Joyce. Dunn's gang had a pattern of eliminating rivals. Dunn's motivation could have been revenge. Joyce had vowed to avenge his brother's murder. He refused to submit to Fingless control, or Dunn may have wanted to punish him for failing to dispose of the murder weapon. Dunn's gang also may have believed Joyce might cooperate with the guards or become a liability. This was similar to the fate of hitman Christy Gilroy. Dunn's own fate underscores the climate of betrayal. He was shot dead by associates at a birthday party in April 2010. His death came just 3 months after Joyce's murder. It prevented any direct retribution. Some investigators speculated that Christopher Gilroy, the deceased hitman, may have been involved in earlier attacks on Joyce. The gunman who shot Joyce in June 2008 was also suspected of the Cronin and Maloney murders. This suggests Gilroy may have been involved. However, Gilroy disappeared a year before Joyce's murder. He could not have carried out the January 2010 shooting. Eric Wilson, the contract killer known as Lucky, worked for various gangs including Dunn's. A report states that Wilson compiled a hit list for a Dublin gang. He murdered Christy Gilroy in Spain after luring him there. Wilson's role in orchestrating hits suggests he could have been involved in Joyce's murder. However, no direct evidence links him to the killing. Garda sources also mentioned a major West Side crime gang boss who issued a €30,000 contract on Joyce's head. This unnamed figure was one of Dublin's most powerful drug dealers. He had clashed with Joyce's gang over trafficking territory. The contract may have been separate from the feud with Dunn. It illustrates how many enemies Joyce had. Some Garda officers speculated that Joyce was killed by his own associates. Reports indicate that detectives thought he might have been abducted and shot by people within his own gang. Gangland criminals often turn on each other when suspicion arises. Joyce was known to be paranoid and violent. This made betrayal plausible. Joyce's murder and the killings that preceded it devastated the traveller community at Grove Lane. At his funeral in Ashbourne, County Meath, the priest said the parents of John Paul and Tommy Joyce had been plunged into darkness twice within a year. Joyce's fiancée, Leah Murphy, and their 2 children, Bonnie and Joe John, were left behind. The killings reinforced negative stereotypes of travellers as criminals. Yet many travellers said that only a small number of their community were involved in organised crime. The public saw scenes of heavy Gardaí operations at halting sites. They saw seizures of expensive cars and arrests of young men. This drew unwanted attention to legitimate traveller families. The murders of B.J. Clark, Tommy Joyce, and John Paul Joyce occurred in rapid succession. They overwhelmed Gardaí resources. The station in Coolock was under-resourced. It typically had only about 20 uniformed officers on duty at any time. During January 2010, officers were simultaneously investigating the kidnapping and murder of John Paul Joyce, the stabbing of another man, and a fatal road accident. This resource shortage hampered investigations. Senior Garda officials admitted they could not adequately patrol the area. Criminals sensed weakness and continued to operate. Witness intimidation further hindered progress. Joyce's murder did not end the violence. Eamon Dunn himself was assassinated in April 2010 by his own associates. His killing was welcomed by many criminals who saw him as unpredictable and dangerous. But it did not eliminate the gang. Younger members continued operations. Subsequent years saw further murders in Dublin's gangland, though the intensity of the feud dissipated after key figures died. Joyce's murder is one of dozens of unsolved gangland killings in Ireland. These cases are difficult to solve because many victims live secretive lives. Their families fear cooperating with Garda. Some murders are what investigators call no-body killings. Bodies disappear, such as that of Christy Gilroy. This indicates the lengths criminals go to hide evidence. In Joyce's case, his body was found. but fear and silence have still prevented convictions. The unsolved murder of John Paul Joyce shows the brutal cycle of violence in Dublin's gangland during the late 2000s. Joyce and his brothers rose rapidly from a traveller halting site to become major drug traffickers. They amassed wealth and enemies. Their feud with Eamon Dunn's Fingless gang triggered a sequence of murders. B.J. Clark was killed, Tommy Joyce was killed, Rolly Cronin and James Maloney were killed, and finally, John Paul Joyce was killed. Investigators believe Joyce was abducted and shot by members of Dunn's gang. This may have been because he failed to dispose of a murder weapon, or because rivals feared he would retaliate. He may also have been betrayed by associates or targeted by other gangs. The presence of a €30,000 contract on his head underscores the many motives for his murder. The primary suspects, Eamon Dunn and hitman Christy Gilroy, were themselves killed shortly after. This ensures that the full truth remains elusive. For the traveller community, the killings brought grief and increased stigma. For Gardaí, they exposed serious resourcing challenges and the need for stronger witness protection programs. More than 15 years later, the ditch behind Dublin Airport where Joyce was dumped remains a reminder. It shows how quickly gangland feuds can spiral and how difficult it is to bring killers to justice. The case continues to symbolise the dark side of Ireland's capital, a world where greed, revenge and betrayal often trump loyalty and life. You know the Kinahan Cartel that controls drugs in Ireland now? Well, before them, there was another family doing the same thing.
This was a man who was really the godfather of heroin in Ireland.
Some of the kids were robbing their mothers, their fathers. There were syringes on balconies.
This was a life and death issue for an awful lot of people.
Young people were dying, communities were devastated. He was a mercenary. All roads led to Larry Dunn.
Larry Dunn and his brothers were the first ones to flood Dublin with heroin. This was back in the 1970s and 1980s. The Dunns were a big family. They were into everything illegal you can think of. They started out doing theft and armed robberies and all sorts of criminal stuff. Then they figured out they could make way more money selling drugs. They brought in massive amounts of heroin and sold it in working-class neighborhoods in the inner city.
That we may have as many as 4,500 heroin users in Dublin City.
The drugs wrecked people's lives. Even their own relatives got destroyed by it. The brothers didn't all work together as one gang. Different combinations of them teamed up at different times. But Larry was the one who became the most notorious criminal in the family. Once the drug money started rolling in, Larry moved from his council house to a detached house up in the scenic Dublin mountains. He wanted to get far away from the decaying communities where he was selling drugs. He went so far away that he actually told his family not to call him or visit his house. Here's the crazy part. Larry was this massive figure in the criminal underworld, but he was never charged or convicted of any serious crimes. He only got in trouble for stupid stuff like driving without insurance. That got him banned from driving. So to get around this, Larry bought himself a horse and carriage. He'd use it to take himself and his wife Lily to the nearby Blue Light pub for drinks on a regular basis. He was the man at the top. He was just the supplier. His brothers ran the operations in the city and communities. Larry had one rule: Larry doesn't carry. That meant he stayed far away from the actual drugs. He used a group of dealers to push the stuff. This made it really hard for the Gardaí to pin anything on him. He was living a lavish lifestyle. His brother Henry bought a racehorse. They didn't know that all this flashy spending was attracting the interest of the Gardaí. The head of the Garda was putting pressure on his senior officers to get Larry off the streets, or at least hit them hard and stop their criminal activities. This time in Dublin was gritty, poor, and politically tense. The city showed signs of being stuck between tradition and change. The 70s and 80s saw most of Dublin recovering from decades of economic stagnation. Some streets were run down. The unemployment rate was rising. This caused a mini migration of young Irish people moving to America or Britain to find work. Over in Northern Ireland, there were serious issues to be sorted out. Bombings in 1974 killed 33 people in the city. The church had major influence back then. Ireland was a very conservative nation. Divorce and contraception were banned in the country. Pubs served as the main form of entertainment for the residents.
There is no doubt about it, but inside here the stout's flowing and the pub is packed with people from all walks of life.
By the 1980s, heroin addiction hit the country hard. Dublin got hit the hardest, especially places like Ballymun, Finglas, and the inner city flats. Crime was on the rise. More notorious gangland figures started to show their faces. But despite all the social and political problems, the Irish still showed a sense of pride and community. Local markets were popular, full of life, bargains, and banter. Markets like Moore Street were the heart of it all. The women known as the Moore Street traders sold fruit, vegetables, and flowers from their wooden stalls. They'd shout out the prices in their strong Dublin accents.
My name is Caroline Allwright. I'm over 40 years here, about 46 years. I'm fourth generation.
The smallest butcher shop in Ireland, but we give you honest to God value now.
£5 a carrot, £8 a sprout.
Ox-hearts, lamb's hearts, rib steak, round steak and sirloin steak. And we give you £2 of chops, not £1. £2 of chops now for 50 pence.
Carrot, turn up, club enough.
What else do you like with the cauliflower?
Now, girls, you're saving nearly 80 pence on every shoulder of bacon you buy here this morning. Isn't that value?
Liberty Market was located near Meath Street. It was packed on weekends. This was a place where you could buy anything from second-hand clothes to dodgy electronics and the popular bootleg tapes. Money was tight. The markets filled the gaps the government could never fill. They helped ordinary Irish people make ends meet. Larry Dunn's greed damaged some of this Irish culture and community. Heroin tears families apart from the inside. It doesn't just affect the person who uses it. It leads to lies, theft, and crime going on the rise as people try to get their fix. Larry Dunn died at the age of 72. He was one of 16 children in a family that had 11 boys and 5 girls. His father, Christy Bronco Dunn, was Ireland's first Godfather. He styled himself on Michael Corleone from the Godfather movies. From his first stint in Mountjoy Prison in 1968 to his conviction for stolen checks in Spain in 1985, he was regarded as one of the state's most incorrigible and flamboyant criminals. Christie started his life in the very markets that his sons would later help destroy. At 8 years old, he was working in Hyde Market. He was in and out of jail throughout his life. He would also go away for work to England when he wasn't in jail. This led the boys to roam the streets. The family bounced around a few areas before finally settling down on Rutland Avenue in Crumlin. A few of them weren't involved in crime and led decent, respectable lives in Ireland and England. In May 1962, Larry was just 12 years old. His brother Michael was just 8 years old. They took off to London to look for their father. Can you imagine that? 2 young kids travelling to London by themselves. They hung around the city for a few days before they got separated in Hyde Park. A missing child article ran on the front of the Daily Mirror. That's what led to them reuniting with their father. The authorities sent them back to Dublin. Not long after, the 2 of them ended up in what they called industrial schools. 6 of their brothers went to these places too. Larry was sent off to Letterfrack in County Galway, then later to Dangin in County Offaly. He didn't stay there long though. As a teenager, Larry went back to England. He racked up over 18 convictions for petty crimes. Over the years, Larry was taking part in petty crimes in Ireland and England. When he was in his early 20s, he joined some of his older brothers who were running a gang that took part in armed robberies. Larry himself got shot in the arm by accident during a botched robbery. Larry was a latecomer to serious crimes, but what happened was that he learned quickly. His other brothers decided to be criminals mainly on the street level. Larry was different. He was the only one who planned criminal activities on a long-term basis where illegal drugs were concerned. He had some troubled times in 1979. He got caught up with drugs and started getting high on his own supply. It was his wife and 3 children that stopped him from going down the addict route. He settled down and went back to his criminal ways. Larry Dunn started making big money importing heroin from Iran. He worked with his supplier, who was known only as the American. This was a time when drug traffickers were running drugs on the Golden Crescent trafficking route. This route covered regions like Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. These areas became the world's major heroin production zones. It was easy to get drugs into Europe at that time through this smuggling route. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, state control was weak. The borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan were practically non-existent. This turmoil made Iran a key transit route for opium and morphine base from Afghanistan. The raw product was mostly processed into heroin in Pakistan or Iran. Then it was smuggled west through Turkey, then into the rest of Europe through the Balkans or the Mediterranean. Early in the 1980s, Irish and British dealers, including the Dunn family, were sourcing heroin that had been smuggled through these routes. The drugs didn't move directly from Iran to Ireland, but Iran was a crucial link in the pipeline. The heroin that reached Dublin in those days was called Persian brown because of the region it came from. The first time Larry got into serious trouble with the law was when he broke his own rule. The same one I mentioned before, Larry doesn't carry. On October 13, 1980, around 9 in the night, two groups of Gardaí did an operation on his house in Carrickmount Drive. There were two operations on the same house at the same time. One group of detectives was investigating the Dunn drug empire. Another group was targeting the other criminal activities he took part in, like jewelry heists. They searched his home for stolen jewelry. One detective found heroin in a pillowcase in one of the children's bedrooms. They also found some cocaine, cannabis, and weighing scales in the house. Larry was trying to make sure there was no confusion. He probably wanted to protect his wife and children. He stepped up and let the officers know that he was the one responsible for everything. Then he went silent. This was an interesting case. The charges were dropped against the other family members who were tied to the drugs and were the ones who had brought the drugs to the house. Larry was released on bail not long after. He continued to operate his drug gang. In a move that was like spitting in the face of the Gardaí, he bought a house for £100,000 all in cash. The house was located on Woodside Road in the Dublin Mountains. It had a view of the Dublin Bay. This purchase was made in May 1982. That house would be around £450,000 in 2025. The trial for the drugs started roughly a year after this purchase was made. This was in the spring of 1983. Courtroom reporters stated that Larry Dunn selected his own jurors for the trial. He picked ones he could easily bribe or threaten. This seemed to work. When the jurors retired on April 26th, a single juror held out for a not guilty verdict on all charges except the possession of drugs for personal use. The presiding judge refused to accept the verdict. At 11 o'clock that night, the jury foreman told the judge again they had been unable to reach a verdict. While all this was going on, Larry Dunn had time to order a bottle of champagne from the Legal Eagle pub. This pub was across the street from the Four Courts courthouse. He did this in anticipation of a favourable verdict. This move changed the legal system and procedures in Ireland. Larry was scheduled to appear for a second trial at the Central Criminal Court on June 21, 1984. This time, there was legislation that allowed majority verdicts in criminal trials for the first time. This move was to reduce intimidations and bribery in trials, especially ones including gangs and organised crime. This is legislation that is still valid and in use today in Irish courts. A day and a half into his second trial, Larry Dunn saw all the evidence being presented. He knew his time as a free man was coming to an end. So at lunchtime, he went across the street to the Molly Malone pub. He changed his clothes and got into a waiting taxi and disappeared. This move changed Ireland's legal history again. The trial proceeded without his presence. The jury in this trial took a little under 20 minutes to convict him on all counts. These charges carried a maximum of 14 years in prison. The press interviewed his wife after he went into hiding. She claimed that Larry was well away by now. She pleaded that he should stay away in a safe house. He was in hiding for around 6 months. He made his way to Spain. In 1985, Dunn was arrested while he was trying to enter Portugal with false documents. He was then extradited back to Ireland to serve his 14-year sentence. During his time in prison, things changed fast. The new dealers took over and started to control the drug trade. Most notable were John Gilligan's gang and the Kinahan Cartel. The Kinahans seized total control of the Irish drug trade. This happened after the man who started the large-scale importation of heroin into Ireland went to prison. Dunn and the Gardaí kind of shared the same sentiment. The Gardaí said the days of the ordinary criminals were over. Larry Dunn said that if the people of Ireland thought he was bad, wait until they saw what was coming. He was right. The years after he lost his grip on the Dublin drug trade, the bloodbaths started over money, territory, and control. Dunn became a thing of the past. The criminal underworld moved on rapidly without him. He returned to live in Carrickmount Drive with his daughter. Lily passed away in 2000. At this time, Larry was suffering from lung cancer. When he was taken to St. James Hospital, it is reported that he died from self-inflicted wounds. This is a tragic end to the life of the man who started the Dublin illegal drug trade, but it's not as tragic as the families and lives he damaged for profits and notoriety.
The Kinahans are in my newsfeed. I'm Jack Kelly. I'm a retired special agent from the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. And I'm following everything. I was reading about the Kinahans and the war they had with the Huts.
The Kinahan Transnational Criminal Organization, also known as the KTCO, has been accused of a wide range of heinous crimes all around the world, including murder.
The Kinahans were street dealers who became billionaires.
When you see the DEA are on their case, you're up there with the most wanted globally. You're in the league of Pablo Escobar, Chapo Guzman, They'd come a long way.
The United States Department of State is pleased to announce a reward of up to $5 million for information leading to the financial disruption of the KTCO or the arrest and convictions of its leaders.
If your aim were to ensure the survival of Ireland's most formidable criminal syndicate, nurturing it, watching it thrive, and eventually seeing it re-emerge as one of the globe's most infamous drug empires, well, here's precisely how you'd go about it. You'd vanish, wouldn't you? Slip off to a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty, much like the Kinahans did in the mid-2000s when they legged it to Dubai. You'd strike up arrangements with both Irish and British gangs, offering them use of your tried and tested smuggling routes in return for a tidy slice of their profits, naturally. You'd tap into international contacts, wouldn't you? Mexican cartels, Hezbollah, perhaps even Iran's intelligence network. It's all about reach. And legitimacy? Easy. You'd cozy up to celebrities and professional athletes, using their clout to polish your public image, while laundering billions through a maze of shell companies and plush property portfolios in the UAE. But the real masterstroke? You'd create a proper franchise model, not just a middleman, but the Kingpin distributor, the McDonald's of cocaine trafficking, if you will. That is exactly what the Kinahan Cartel has done. Born from the streets of Dublin in the late 1980s, Christy Kinahan's group has morphed into a transnational criminal organization comparable in scale to Italy's Camorra or Colombia's Clan del Golfo. The US State Department calls it a transnational criminal organization whose leaders direct narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and violent crime across 4 continents. Ireland's police, the Gardaí, say the cartel is now taking a stake in other gangs' drug deals. It supplies them with logistics, contacts, and even quality control in exchange for a cut of multi-million euro consignments. In other words, the Kinahans have gone corporate. This true crime documentary exposes how the cartel reinvented itself, regained control of Ireland's cocaine market, and expanded its reach through state-backed alliances. Drawing on primary sources, law enforcement reports, and contemporary news, it also asks a series of questions that the public, and sometimes even investigators, have overlooked. How did a gang of heroin dealers become a global narco-state with the ability to influence Middle Eastern policy? Why do celebrities continue to mix with cartel lieutenants? What happens when organized crime becomes a tool of statecraft? And why have so many aspects of the Kinahan story been overlooked, under-investigated, or conveniently ignored? The Kinahan story begins in Dublin's inner city, where Christy Kinahan built his reputation in the late 1980s on heroin deals, fraud, and smuggling. Irish intelligence records show he served prison time in the mid-1980s for possessing a large heroin shipment. In prison, he learned foreign languages, forged contacts, and hardened his network. Upon release, he relocated to the Netherlands and Spain, jurisdictions with lax attitudes to narcotics trafficking, and began building a sophisticated distribution network. By the late 1990s, as Ireland's Celtic Tiger economy boomed and cocaine demand surged, Kinahan upgraded from street dealing into transnational trafficking. He adopted a decentralized cell structure, delegating day-to-day risks to lieutenants while preserving strategic control, money, and contacts. His sons Daniel and Christopher Jr. were groomed to run the logistics and enforcement arms. This shift from local gang to cartel mirrored the internationalization of Irish organized crime. With distribution hubs in Spain's Costa del Sol and the Netherlands' port of Rotterdam, the group aligned itself with Colombian and Mexican suppliers and began importing multi-ton loads of cocaine and heroin into Europe. Money laundering became a core pillar. The cartel ran shell companies and cross-border investments to wash proceeds. It invested in property, hospitality, and legitimate businesses to mask its illegal cash. While Christy remained the strategist, his eldest son Daniel emerged as the public face. By the early 2000s, Daniel portrayed himself as a boxing promoter, forming MTK Global, originally MGM. The company managed fighters such as Tyson Fury and Billy Joe Saunders, providing the cartel a veneer of respectability.
Daniel Kinahan, the biggest fight in British boxing history, has just been agreed. Get up there, my boy!
Behind the scenes, Daniel managed shipments, negotiated with Colombian suppliers, and dealt with European middlemen. The Irish High Court later described him as controlling and managing operations across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The bloodiest episode in the cartel's history began in September 2015. Gary Hutch, a nephew of Dublin gang boss Gerry Hutch, was shot dead near Marbella, Spain. This killing sparked the Hutch-Kinahan feud, a violent war that left at least 18 people dead. In February 2016, a group of gunmen disguised as police stormed the Regency Hotel in Dublin during a boxing weigh-in, killing Daniel Kinahan's associate David Byrne. The attack was intended to assassinate Daniel himself. The feud spawned retaliatory murders, bombings and mistaken identity killings across Ireland and Spain, drawing media attention to the Kinahans and forcing authorities to prioritize the cartel's dismantling. One might expect such a public bloodbath to cripple a criminal organization. Yet the feud forced the cartel to adapt. Greater Garda surveillance drove the leadership to seek safe haven abroad. In the mid-2000s, as Irish and Spanish police intensified investigations, Christy, Daniel, and Christopher Jr. relocated to Dubai, exploiting the United Arab Emirates' lack of an extradition treaty with the European Union. From luxury villas in Dubai's Jumeirah district, the Kinahans directed operations via encrypted messaging apps while using legitimate businesses to launder revenue. Their relocation also allowed them to cultivate new alliances with Middle Eastern and Latin American groups. The cartel's violence extended far beyond Ireland. According to a confidential Europol report revealed by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the Kinahans were linked to specialized hit squads responsible for at least 20 murders across Belgium, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Spain. These killings included rivals, suspected informants, and innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. Europol noted that the cartel created specialized crime cells designed specifically to kill rivals, yet the majority of these crimes never led to convictions, raising an uncomfortable question. Why have European authorities struggled to bring these killers to justice? Have failures in international cooperation allowed the cartel's assassins to operate with impunity? Global scrutiny intensified when the US Treasury Department designated the Kinahan Transnational Criminal Organization as a major organized crime group in April 2022. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, sanctioned Christy, Daniel, and Christopher Kinahan Jr., freezing their US assets and prohibiting any US citizen from dealing with them. The State Department offered rewards of up to $5 million each for information leading to their arrest. These sanctions, rarely used against European crime families, signaled the cartel's international reach. The US described the KTCO as a group engaged in drug trafficking, money laundering, and violent crime. Sanctions also targeted cartel associates such as key enforcer Liam Byrne and his logistician cohorts, further freezing their accounts and properties. Yet sanctions did not immediately collapse the cartel. Daniel's boxing enterprise, MTK Global, continued to operate until April 2022, when media scrutiny forced it to cease operations. Tyson Fury faced criticism for his association with Daniel. He publicly distanced himself.
Daniel Kinahan was sanctioned. What was your relationship with him, and what's your relationship going to be going forward?
I've just had a million questions about all this rubbish before, but like I said to them, it's none of my business, and I don't get involved in other people's business, so it doesn't really concern me.
Insisting he did not get involved in others' affairs. Promoter Bob Arum later conceded that Daniel had duped him into believing he had left crime behind. Meanwhile, MTK's closure exposed how the cartel used sport to infiltrate mainstream culture and launder reputations. After the feud and sanctions decimated its domestic distribution group, the cartel needed a new way to maintain profits without exposing its leadership. Garda intelligence revealed that by 2023, the Kinahans had adopted a franchisee system. Instead of running every shipment themselves, they now supply smaller Irish gangs with contacts, logistics, and know-how in exchange for a stake in drug consignments worth 5 to 10 million euros. Under the franchise model, local gangs piggyback on the Kinahans' shipping infrastructure. The cartel arranges the connections to South American suppliers and provides guidance on smuggling routes, but it does not take ownership of the drugs. This reduces risk for the leadership. If a shipment is intercepted, the local gang takes the fall, while the Kinahans still collect a percentage. According to security sources interviewed by the Irish Times, the cartel's franchise makes it more attractive for new players to enter the drug market, but it also creates vulnerabilities. The involvement of multiple parties increases the risk of detection and leaks, and Gardaí have already seized consignments arranged under this model. However, the system has allowed the cartel to reassert control over Ireland's cocaine market. Almost every gang that filled the vacuum after the Kinahans fled now reports to them. Traffickers from Dublin, Cork, and other counties have flown to Dubai to negotiate direct shipments, with groups like the Family from Clondalkin and an established crew from Cabra seeking permission to import cocaine through Kinahan routes. This centralization has also reduced gangland killings and turf wars, as supplies are steady and prices stable. Peace, in this case, is enforced not by the Gardaí, but by fear and loyalty to the cartel. Isn't it peculiar that a criminal organization could invent a distribution strategy reminiscent of legitimate franchising? The Kinahans have essentially built a narcotics supply chain that functions like a fast food chain. Franchisees pay for the brand name, logistics, and quality assurance, while the franchisor collects royalties. Why haven't lawmakers designed new laws to outlaw this specific form of criminal collaboration? And what happens when violent organizations begin to adopt business models perfected by legitimate corporations? Dubai was once a sanctuary for the cartel. Its luxury properties and lax regulation allowed the Kinahans to invest in villas and operate freely. Christy and Daniel purchased at least 4 properties in Dubai through shell companies, including a multi-million-dollar villa in the exclusive Palm Jumeirah. The ICIJ documented how Daniel's wife used these properties to build a portfolio even after US sanctions were imposed, highlighting the UAE's opaque real estate market. For years, Irish and British authorities complained that the absence of an extradition treaty with the EU turned Dubai into a gangster's paradise. Pressure finally brought change. In 2024, Ireland's Justice Minister Helen McEntee travelled to Abu Dhabi to sign treaties on extradition and mutual legal assistance. The new agreements allowed Irish courts to request the extradition of wanted criminals and to cooperate on seizing assets. Within months, the UAE extradited Sean McGovern, a senior cartel member accused of directing organised crime and murder, to Ireland, the first extradition of its kind. McGovern had been detained in Dubai under an Interpol red notice after being shot during the Regency attack. His transfer required a special one-off arrangement because the treaties had not yet become retrospective. Irish authorities hoped to use the treaty to extradite the leaders themselves. Yet no one knows whether Dubai will surrender Christy, Daniel, or Christopher. Garda Deputy Commissioner Shauna Coxon hailed the McGovern extradition as a significant development and noted that transnational crime gangs cause misery not only in Ireland but throughout the world. The Kinahans, sensing the new threat, have reportedly increased security and become more paranoid, traveling with armed bodyguards and limiting their movements. Rumors persist that they may relocate to Kish Island, an Iranian free trade zone beyond the reach of Western law enforcement. If they do move to Iran, will the EU or US have any legal means to pursue them? And does their potential alliance with Tehran mean they could become a geopolitical proxy as well as a narcotics trafficker? The cartel's suspected ties to Iran illustrate how organized crime can become a tool of foreign policy. In 2025, New Lines magazine reported that Iran has been weaponizing Europe's criminal underworld, using gangs like Sweden's Foxtrot and Ireland's Kinahan Cartel to further its geopolitical aims. According to the investigation, the Kinahans' relationship with Tehran dates back to at least 2016. Irish police discovered that the cartel had contracted a Dutch-Moroccan criminal to assassinate an Iranian dissident. US Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) officials later learned that the Kinahans were laundering money on Kish Island, a free trade zone known for lax regulation. They also uncovered allegations that Christy Kinahan sought to purchase airplane parts for Iran, an indication that the cartel might have been facilitating sanctions evasion. Furthermore, reports emerged that the group conducted business with Hezbollah, funneling money through Syria and Lebanon. These findings raise troubling questions. Was the cartel's pivot toward Iran an act of opportunism or an element of Iranian strategy? US sanctions restricting Iran's access to aircraft parts and foreign currency created a lucrative market for smuggling. If the Kinahans were involved, did they receive protection in return? Could this help explain why they have not been arrested despite international warrants? The New Lines investigation warns that Iranian intelligence agencies rely on transnational crime syndicates to conduct assassinations, launder money, and procure equipment. If Europe's most notorious drug cartel is entangled in this network, the Kinahan story is no longer just about narcotics, it's about national security. The cartel's global reach extends beyond Iran. Investigative reporters have revealed that the Kinahans collaborate with Mexican cartels, Hezbollah, and other criminal organizations to transport cocaine into Europe. An Irish Examiner report on the 2023 seizure of the MV Matthew, a bulk carrier intercepted off the Irish coast with more than 2.2 tons of cocaine, revealed that Iranian nationals linked to Hezbollah were involved alongside Kinahan operatives. A man known as Captain Noah directed operations from Dubai, while two Iranians, Syed Hassani and Sohail Jelveh, acted as intermediaries with Hezbollah. Gardai believed the Kinahan cartel arranged the shipment as part of its franchise model, providing logistical support and international contacts. The involvement of Hezbollah underscores the cartel's willingness to partner with militant groups to secure drug routes. The New Lines investigation also notes that the Kinahan cartel may have laundered money through Syria and Lebanon, funneling funds to Hezbollah. Such alliances provide mutual benefit. Hezbollah gains access to lucrative smuggling routes and cash. The Kinahans gain protection in regions with minimal law enforcement oversight. Yet these relationships blur the line between organized crime and state-sponsored terrorism. They also raise geopolitical concerns. Could the cartel's infrastructure be used to transport weapons or components for Iran's proxies? The potential for such collaboration demands an intelligence response beyond typical narcotics enforcement. One of the most insidious aspects of the cartel is its infiltration of legitimate sports and celebrity culture. This infiltration serves two purposes. It provides cover and respectability, and it creates leverage over public figures. The story of Steven Gerrard is instructive. In January 2024, British and Irish media reported that former Liverpool footballer Steven Gerrard had become a grandfather. His daughter had a child with Lee Byrne, son of Liam Byrne, a senior Kinahan associate. Gardai warned Gerrard that any association with the Byrne family could damage his public image and potentially compromise his safety. While there is no evidence that Lee is involved in organized crime, the connection illustrates how the cartel's social network extends into the homes of celebrities. The cartel's boxing ties are even deeper. Daniel Kinahan founded MTK Global in 2012. The company grew into a major management agency representing fighters including Tyson Fury, Billy Joe Saunders, Josh Taylor, and Carl Frampton. Fury publicly thanked Daniel for brokering his fight with Anthony Joshua, calling him a trusted advisor. After the US sanctions, Fury attempted to distance himself, insisting he was not involved in other people's business. Yet Daniel had used MTK to negotiate fights and launder his reputation. MTK eventually ceased operations in 2022 due to the scrutiny and pressure from the sanctions. Conor McGregor, the UFC star from Dublin, has also been drawn into the Kinahan orbit through family connections. In 2023, his sister Aoife posted a photo with Graham Whelan, a convicted drug dealer and longtime Kinahan associate, celebrating his release at McGregor's pub. Whelan was close to David Byrne, who was killed in the Regency attack. McGregor faced allegations that he had clashed with a man linked to the cartel at a Dublin pub in 2017, sparking rumours of a feud. He denied involvement, but press reports claimed Daniel Kinahan pressured him to walk boxer Michael Conlan into the ring. McGregor refused, and Daniel allegedly leaned on him behind the scenes. The mixture of sport, celebrity, and organized crime is potent. It offers criminals access to mainstream platforms while threatening public figures with reputational damage if they refuse cooperation. Why would celebrities risk associating with gangsters? Some may be unaware of the full background, others may feel coerced. But the real question is why sports organizations and regulators allowed Daniel Kinahan, a man designated by the US as a major drug trafficker, to remain active in boxing until the sanctions. Does this reveal a lack of due diligence? Or have high-profile promoters chosen to ignore warnings in pursuit of profit? When global sport is so entwined with money, what mechanisms exist to keep organized crime from buying influence? To support its operations, the cartel operates an elaborate money laundering apparatus that spans Europe, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. The ICIJ investigation into Christy Kinahan revealed that he used the pen name Chian Sharkin, an anagram of his own name, to write poetry and edit a prison newsletter. He later used the same alias when registering companies. This penchant for aliases reflects the secrecy with which the Kinahans move funds. Records show they set up shell companies in the British Virgin Islands and Cyprus to obscure ownership. Daniel's wife, Kawimhe Robinson, purchased a multi-million-dollar villa in Dubai's Jumeirah Gulf Estates. She also bought 3 additional properties in Dubai after US sanctions were announced. The purchases highlight weaknesses in the UAE's property market, where opaque ownership structures allow criminals to hide assets. The cartel also launders money through trade-based schemes and underground banking. It uses cash couriers, encrypted phones, and crypto assets to move funds across borders. When property or accounts are frozen, it shifts operations to new jurisdictions. This agility, coupled with the difficulty of tracing offshore structures, complicates law enforcement efforts. Investigators who track the financial flows note that the cartel may have hidden $1.5 billion across multiple countries. If so, that money can continue to fund operations even when senior members are arrested. One of the few successful asset seizures occurred after Thomas "Bomber" Kavanagh, the head of the cartel's UK arm, was jailed in March 2022 for masterminding a £30 million smuggling operation. A British court ordered him to repay £1.1 million or face an additional 12 years in prison. Kavanagh, once considered untouchable, managed warehouses in Tamworth containing weapons and drugs. His conviction proved that authorities can hit the cartel financially. Yet by the time of his sentencing, the organization had already pivoted to the franchise model. Even as Kavanagh sits behind bars, shipments continue. Profits, like laundered money, flow through new channels. Beyond the glamour and international intrigue lies a grim reality. The cartel's drugs cause misery. Cocaine smuggled through Kinahan routes fuels addiction across Ireland and Britain. Communities suffer violence, intimidation, and exploitation. The gang's money laundering distorts housing markets and evades taxes that fund public services. Its alliances with terrorist organizations pose risks far beyond drug crime. Yet arrests and convictions remain rare. Why? In multiple murder cases linked to the Kinahans, suspects were acquitted due to witness intimidation or lack of evidence. The ICIJ reported that some murders were ordered from Dubai via encrypted phones. Law enforcement agencies often lacked access to these communications. Meanwhile, Gardaí investigating the cartel faced underfunding and legal hurdles. The absence of extradition treaties meant the leadership operated with impunity. Even after the new UAE-Ireland treaty, extradition remains discretionary. This begs the question, are some governments reluctant to press harder because of economic ties to Dubai, or because of the potential diplomatic fallout with Iran if the cartel can relocate to Kish Island with ease? What does that say about the effectiveness of global counter-narcotics policy? This investigation raises as many questions as it answers. Why did Irish authorities ship the MV Matthew cocaine shipment's debris overseas immediately, preventing a forensic examination? Why were some of the cartel's Dubai properties not seized despite clear evidence of ownership? What intelligence did Western agencies collect on the Kinahan-Iran connection, and why haven't they released it? Who were the beneficiaries of the cartel's early investments in legitimate businesses? Why did some sports promoters ignore warnings about Daniel Kinahan until the US government publicly sanctioned him? Like the 9/11 Commission, which ignored the collapse of World Trade Center 7, Irish and European authorities have sometimes overlooked critical facets of the Kinahan story. For instance, the Hutch-Kinahan feud resulted in at least 18 deaths, yet the full list of victims is rarely acknowledged in official statements. Europol linked the cartel to 20 murders across 4 countries, but few details have been made public. A new inquiry, independent of political pressure, is needed to uncover the truth. Such a commission should investigate government collaboration. What dealings did the Irish, British, and European governments have with Dubai and Tehran regarding the Kinahans? Did intelligence agencies share information that went uninvestigated? Financial networks. How has the cartel managed to launder billions through legal systems? Which banks or institutions facilitated these transactions knowingly or otherwise? Sports infiltration. How did regulators allow a major crime figure to become a leading boxing promoter? What reforms are needed to keep criminal money out of sport? State-crime nexus. What is the extent of the cartel's cooperation with Iran and Hezbollah? Does this collaboration constitute state-sponsored organized crime? Victim compensation. What reparations are owed to communities ravaged by Kinahan drugs and violence? Answering these questions requires transparency and bravery. It may also require confronting uncomfortable truths about how modern states interact with organized crime. The Kinahan cartel shows that drug cartels are not just gangs. They are corporations with political connections, media strategies, and global supply chains. They thrive in the gray areas of international law and exploit the reluctance of nations to cooperate fully. To defeat them, governments must treat them not only as criminals, but as global non-state actors akin to terrorist organizations. Despite years of investigations, sanctions, and arrests, the Kinahan cartel remains resilient. It has reinvented itself as a franchising narco-corporation, regained control of Ireland's cocaine market, and integrated itself into geopolitical power plays. Its leaders are wanted in multiple countries, yet they continue to operate from overseas safe havens. New extradition treaties have raised hopes of bringing them to justice, but there is no guarantee these will be enforced. For now, the cartel enjoys an uneasy peace enforced by fear and supply stability. But history suggests that this calm is temporary. Turf wars may erupt again if the franchise model weakens or if rivals challenge the cartel's monopoly. Iran's involvement could drag the cartel into conflicts far beyond Ireland. The infiltration of sport and celebrity demonstrates how organized crime seeks legitimacy and leverage in mainstream culture. The Kinahan files tell a story of evolution, adaptability, and unresolved justice. They reveal how a family of Dublin criminals built a global empire by leveraging business acumen, state alliances, and social capital. They also illustrate the limits of law enforcement in a world where crime, politics, and business intersect. Until the unanswered questions are addressed, the cartel's victims, from overdose deaths to communities terrorized by violence, will continue to pay the price, and the world will remain fascinated by, and fearful of, the criminals who turn themselves into a brand. In this true crime documentary, we will cover the gangland murder of Martin Hyland, a Dublin gangster who met a brutal end. Hyland thought he was invincible, but little did he know he was a man marked for death. The list of people who wanted him dead included his own criminal associates, along with rival gang leaders. When the guards saw Hyland's body slumped beneath the covers in his niece's house in Finglas, West Dublin, the grim sight was all too familiar to the eyes of detectives. His head was a bloody pulp, his body filled with bullets. Another murder that occurred in the same house was the murder of Anthony Campbell, whose body was in the hall downstairs. He was an innocent plumber who was just called to a job and got killed because he was an unfortunate witness to the gangland murder of Hyland. Anthony Campbell's father had gotten him a temporary job with a plumber to make some extra money for the Christmas season. The killers were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They patiently waited for Hyland's niece to leave the house and drop her kids to school. After the older plumber left for supplies, they made their move. The unsuspecting Campbell opened the door for the hitmen, maybe thinking it was his boss returning with the supplies to finish the plumbing job. It is not known if he was shot immediately after opening the door, but one would think he was killed after they got to Hyland, as to not raise any alarms before they got the main target. These two murders raised the number of violent deaths to 63 in Ireland, in one of the bloodiest years ever recorded. But just 24 hours later, the toll went up again after a man was beaten and run over by a gang of car thieves who were on a crime spree in County Louth. Add to that another gangland murder when another gangster was assassinated in the Irish Financial Services Centre in Dublin. Before we continue, if you enjoy these true crime stories, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop us a comment. We really appreciate it and try our best to reply to everyone. After the events of that week, it was perceived that the capital was being overtaken by ruthless drug dealers. while opposing politicians called for the resignation of the Justice Minister and demanded that the Irish army be sent in to tackle the rise in crime and violence. More murders and drug dealings were being executed. The public and the politicians were calling for measures that were imposed when journalist Veronica Guerin was killed. Even the Archbishop of Dublin at the time joined in condemning the gangsters who were acting like they had the right to kill anyone they felt fit. There was literally no dignity for human life, not even for the innocent bystanders. Garda Commissioner Noel Conroy said that the gangland shootings of that bloody year were hard to solve, with only 23 of the 60-plus murders solved by detectives. But in hindsight, these crimes are notoriously very difficult to prosecute. These murders often happen in plain sight in broad daylight, yet because of how the murders are executed, there is very little chance of getting forensic evidence to prosecute anyone arrested for the crimes. There is usually no contact between the killer and the victim. They drive away in getaway cars, which get burnt out to destroy any lingering evidence. On that day, when detectives saw another gangland boss murdered along with an innocent victim in the wrong place at the wrong time, it read like a similar story. No witnesses, no forensic evidence, and the getaway car burnt out nearby. When a gangland figure is taken out, especially at the top of the criminal underworld, revenge shootings would always follow, and the suspect list of people who wanted to take out Hyland was very big. The brutal murder of Hyland should have been a warning to other criminals to stay away from gangland, but the money and the notoriety always seemed to outweigh the risks. Hyland was a man who collected his social welfare payments from 1993 until his death, as he was listed as unemployed. He was groomed by the notorious Irish gangster P.J. Judge, who was nicknamed the Psycho. He was the dominant drug trafficker in Finglas and Ballymun until he met his bloody end. After the Judge's murder, Marlo stepped into his place. He started his reign by robbing cash vans until he started drug trafficking in the late 90s. He joined forces with another Dublin criminal to bring in a large shipment. His suppliers were mainly from Holland and Spain, where he travelled frequently to get deals done in person. He organised the shipments, payments and money laundering operations. Along with the drugs, he also smuggled guns into Ireland. Coming from the school of P.J. Judge, Hyland was out for blood. Martin's sister was strangled by her husband in 1985. He was imprisoned for over a decade. After he was released, he was gunned down in a drive-by shooting on his way home from a football match. Because of his ties to the criminal underworld, Hyland was the main suspect in this murder. Needless to say, he escaped any serious convictions by keeping his distance from the guns and drugs he supplied. A string of driving offences were all that the guards could get on him during his rise in the Dublin illegal drugs trade. Similar to many gangsters, he tried to cling to a clean-cut life as a person who is a law-abiding citizen. He went on to sue the Sunday World for around €90,000 for describing him as a gangster in an article in 1997. He also won €250,000 in the lotto that he used to explain where he got some of his wealth. However, the Criminal Assets Bureau managed to get his dole payments stopped, using evidence in court to show that he lied about where and how he lived. By 2004, Marlo Hyland was one of the biggest traffickers in Ireland, dealing in heroin and cocaine. He was known to be in deals with both gangsters and politicians to secure his position in the illegal and very violent drugs trade. He was the go-to man for everything illegal. If someone needed a gun for a job, he would organize it through his criminal empire. Using these contacts, he could have these men he's providing guns for turn those guns on other people. Hyland had plans to get rid of a top figure in the IRA faction in Dublin, but these turned out to be rumours, as they were also dealing behind closed doors with him. One of his close associates was a former Dublin brigade leader of the IRA. Another close contact was a Sinn Féin activist who was then implicated in a €2 million tax fraud case. He had a sweet deal with these associates, paying them with money and other assets for protection and allowing him to operate in the areas they controlled. Marlo had all kinds of associates. Another notable one was Patrick Dutchy Holland, a one-time linchpin of John Gilligan's criminal empire, and was one of the men implicated in the gruesome murder of Veronica Guerin. Holland served time in prison and was released after 9 years. After his release, Hyland took care of him. His most notorious gangland figure, however, was Dessie O'Hare, a former INLA gunman who was jailed for a gruesome crime against dentist John O'Grady. Desi was another gangster to benefit from Hyland's generosity from his illegal profits. After Desi was granted temporary release from prison, he was given a place to stay by Marlo Hyland, in one of his many homes he owned across the city, specifically in Finglas and Cabra. Having O'Hare by his side, Hyland sent out a message to his enemies that he is dangerous and has dangerous allies by his side. However, by the time O'Hare was out of jail, Hyland was already under pressure, so he gave him money and shelter for protection. It was being said on the streets that his control and power was weakening from November 2005, when the Justice Minister announced he was setting up the Organised Crime Unit. With their number one target being Martin Hyland, within months he was feeling the full effects of Operation Oak. Houses he was associated with were raided. During these raids, the guards found guns and drugs. In total, they seized more than 23 million euros worth of illegal drugs. Just after this blow, the Criminal Assets Bureau launched another investigation into Martin Hyland and found 150,000 euros in cash stashed in a garage belonging to one of his associates. Members of his network began falling like flies. They were trying to move money and drugs around, but they were getting caught in transit with the drugs and cash, with some of them even being intercepted while on their way to rob cash vans. In all, more than 40 members of his network were arrested in North and West Dublin. Of the 40 suspects arrested, 24 of them were taken to court and charged. Only one of them managed to get released on bail. Based on the way they were arrested and taken in, the members of his network started to think he was an informer, mainly because he managed to evade arrest while being under intense investigation. But what was really happening is that Martin Hyland started to see himself as being invincible. The Underworld, seeing that his people were being caught, now had a feeling that he could get caught, and they started to drift away from him as he was slowly losing his grasp on the criminal enterprise he was running. The pressure was really getting to Hyland. He had 2 of his own drug dealers shot in the span of a 2-month period. One of the men shot was Paddy Hart, who was gunned down because he wanted to branch out on his own after he became successful from selling cannabis he bought from Hyland. Another blow to his organisation was when the guards seized 400,000 euros worth of illegal drugs along with guns at one of his gunrunners' hideouts in County Meath. The man was Paul Ree, a 26-year-old who was then killed on his way to court, and his sister was also injured in the incident. Trying to gain back his notoriety, Hyland started to boast about killings and brutality. He went on to link himself to the death of Biba Saulite, a young Latvian mother of 2, who was murdered in a suspected contract killing in Swords. Even though another man was charged for this killing, in the streets, Hyland didn't deny any rumours that he was behind the killing. He was going on about many other crimes and murders that were taking place in Dublin. Murders, robberies. He was associating himself to everything, even though people knew he had nothing to do with them. When the guards found out about the threats on his life, they called him to warn him as it was their duty. He got the last call about the threats just 5 days before his murder. Hyland knew his time was running out. Garda sources said he'd been warned to watch his back and change his daily habits. But it didn't matter. He was living on borrowed time. When it came to suspects, there wasn't one clear name, just a long list of people who might have wanted him gone. Old friends, enemies, even some of his own gang. Garda sources said a few of his own crew wanted Hyland dead, as did 2 rival drug gangs. Some even pointed to former IRA members he'd fallen out with, but investigators doubted they were behind it. Desi O'Hare's name came up too, but not near the top. He'd claimed to be helping the sick in Lords, though Gardaí believed he was still in Ireland when Hyland was shot. He might not have pulled the trigger, but his ties to known criminals could still land him back behind bars for breaking his early release terms. After the murder, the Justice Minister turned his attention to the courts, criticising judges for letting almost all of Hyland's gang out on bail. A cabinet meeting was planned to discuss tougher measures. Some politicians were even calling for the Special Criminal Court to be used against gang figures based only on senior Garda testimony. The Garda Commissioner also announced a stronger organised crime unit, though some officers felt the focus was wrong. That policing worked best when Gardaí were out on the streets, not stuck behind desks. But it wasn't Hyland's killing alone that shocked the country. It was the growing number of innocent people caught in the crossfire. People like Anthony Campbell and the young mothers Donna Cleary and Biba Sarlight, or 23-year-old Keith Fitzsimons, shot dead that June. Each one a reminder that gang violence wasn't just taking down criminals, it was tearing through ordinary lives. The murders of Marlo Hyland and Gerard Byrne hit Dublin hard. Hyland was gunned down at his home in Finglas. Byrne was found dead near the Financial Services Centre just a day later. Normally, these killings would make headlines for a few days and then fade away. But this time was different, because Anthony Campbell, a young plumber who happened to be working in Hyland's house, became a deliberate target. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't part of the underworld. Just an ordinary man, caught in the middle of someone else's war. Despite the government's assurance that there was no IRA involvement, some Garda sources weren't convinced. They couldn't rule out the possibility that ex-IRA members had turned their old skills to a new trade, organized crime. For months, Garda surveillance teams had been watching Hyland closely. His connections were dangerous, especially his link with Dessie O'Hare, a name that still carried weight from the days of the Troubles. O'Hare had served 14 years of a 40-year sentence for kidnapping Dublin dentist John O'Grady back in 1987, one of the worst security crises in Irish history. He was once one of the most feared figures in the Irish National Liberation Army. Since his release, O'Hare claimed he had cut ties with the underworld. Gardaí weren't so sure. He'd been seen meeting known criminals, including Marlo Hyland himself. A few days before Hyland was murdered, O'Hare made a strange move. He went to Lourdes. Gardaí said there was no sign he was religious, and some suspected it was an alibi. They believed he may have helped set Hyland up. Given his violent past and his record with the INLA, the theory was taken seriously. O'Hare wasn't the only ex-paramilitary figure making a return. Garda intelligence suggested several former IRA men had used their old connections and discipline to profit from drugs, robberies, and gun running. The murder of Anthony Campbell showed how far things had gone. The hitmen who killed Hyland knew exactly when his relatives would leave the house that morning. It was planned down to the minute. Campbell was never supposed to be there. When he was, the killers made the cold, professional decision: no witnesses. Hyland was shot in the head. So was Campbell, both executed with precision. Gardaí said it had all the hallmarks of trained professionals, possibly men with paramilitary backgrounds. Over time, a pattern began to emerge. Former IRA and INLA men, once soldiers of ideology, were now being linked to hijackings, drug smuggling, and contract killings. Garda sources named one ex-IRA officer commanding who'd been stood down in 2004 after revelations about his involvement in robberies and kidnappings. Another former IRA figure was said to be running a criminal network from Spain, using old arms routes to ship drugs and cigarettes into Dublin. One man in his late 40s, released under the Good Friday Agreement, had become deeply involved in heroin trafficking. Another, based in Belfast, was tied to tiger kidnappings, where families are held hostage while loved ones are forced to hand over cash from banks or businesses. One such kidnapping took place in Rochestown, Cork, where a businessman and his family were taken hostage. Gardaí arrested 2 suspects, but their main target, a Belfast man, escaped. He was later arrested in England but released for lack of evidence. Today, Gardaí believe he's still active, moving between Dublin and the north, with ties to former terrorist cells that are drifting back into organised crime. Across Ireland, frustration is growing. People are demanding tougher laws and stronger courts. A recent poll showed that 96% of the public support using the Special Criminal Court to deal with gang leaders and drug dealers. 75% also back administrative detention orders, similar to those used in Holland, to lock up serious offenders without trial. As one Dublin man put it, there's a sense of lawlessness. Criminal gangs act as they please. That plumber didn't ask to be dragged into a gang war. A woman from the countryside said, "It feels like there are 2 Irelands now. The decent one, and the one with guns, knives, and drive-by shootings." Martin Marlo Hyland was born and raised in Finglas, a working-class suburb on the north side of Dublin. From an early age, he was surrounded by the same mix of poverty, loyalty, and quiet ambition that defined much of Dublin's rougher estates during the late 1970s and 1980s. Those who knew him in his youth described a boy who was streetwise long before his years. confident but calculated, and never one to be told what to do. He grew up during a time when unemployment was high, heroin was flooding the capital, and organized crime was quickly replacing petty theft as the way to make serious money. Hyland started small. In his teens, he was involved in low-level rackets, stolen cars, cigarettes, and counterfeit goods, but his eye was always on the larger picture. He had a sharp understanding of how street economies worked and how to control them without drawing too much attention. By his 20s, he was deeply embedded in the Dublin criminal scene, aligning himself with figures who were rising fast in the city's underworld. He built connections in places like Finglas, Ballymun, and Blanchardstown, where crime families and local crews competed for control of drug supply routes. Unlike some of his more volatile peers, Hyland was known for his calm temperament. He preferred quiet influence over public displays of aggression. Those who worked under him described him as disciplined and extremely organized. He treated criminal operations like a business, structured, efficient, and deliberately removed from street-level chaos. This approach earned him both respect and fear. He demanded loyalty, but was known to reward it handsomely. By the late 1990s, Hyland had moved into large-scale drug trafficking. He formed ties with suppliers in the UK and mainland Europe, sourcing cocaine and cannabis that flowed into Ireland through hidden shipments. Finglas became one of his key strongholds, a base of operations disguised by its ordinary suburban appearance. Under his control, Hyland managed to run a vast criminal network that stretched far beyond Dublin. At the same time, he kept an image of being approachable and local. In the community, he was known to help neighbors with small favors, paying bills, settling disputes, or funding local events. To some, he seemed like a protector. To others, he was simply maintaining control through goodwill. He was rarely seen without his close associates, and his network included several trusted lieutenants who handled money laundering, logistics, and security. Hyland also had a reputation for being careful with money. He invested in property and legitimate businesses as a cover for his criminal income. Unlike some other gang leaders, he didn't flaunt wealth openly, preferring a quieter form of power. Still, within the criminal world, everyone knew that Marlo was one of the most powerful figures operating in Ireland. He had connections to nearly every major crew in Dublin and maintained uneasy alliances with rival gangs when it suited his business interests. As Ireland's economy boomed in the early 2000s, the drug trade expanded with it. Hyland capitalized on this growth, importing larger quantities and pushing distribution through networks that reached every corner of the country. His name became synonymous with control and stability in a scene often ruled by chaos. Police intelligence reports during this time placed him at the top of the Dublin underworld hierarchy, a man with both money and influence, who could move drugs on an industrial scale and still blend into ordinary suburban life. To the outside world, Hyland was just another quiet man from Finglas. To those inside the criminal fraternity, he was the boss, methodical, feared, and respected. He built his empire on structure, silence, and loyalty, turning a small-time street hustle into one of Ireland's most formidable drug operations before everything around him began to unravel. In this true crime documentary, we look at one of Ireland's most notorious gangland figures, Eamon Dunn, also known as the Don, and the face of Ireland's gangland during the mid-2000s. Eamon Dunn knew he was a marked man who always had to look over his shoulder because, at any minute, someone would be out to get him. On April 23, 2010, he was sitting in the Fassor House pub in Dublin. Moments before he could pay the lounge boy for a soda, his killer arrived. Just minutes earlier, a red VW Passat had pulled up outside the pub located in Cabra, and 3 armed men with their faces covered came out of the car. One of the men stood at the door while the other 2 walked into the pub. This was well planned and orchestrated so that Dunn could not make an escape. Of the 2 men that walked into the pub, one stood back to keep guard while the shooter walked up to Eamon and shouted at terrified punters to get down on the floor. In a desperate move, Dunn grabbed the lounge boy to use him as a human shield. Luckily, someone in close proximity pushed the lounge boy out of the way just before the gunman fired the shots. Over 12 shots were fired in this gangland assassination. 2 shots went directly to the head and 3 others hit vital organs, leaving Dunn with no chance of survival. Graham Farrell, who was with Dunn when he was shot, mentioned that he saw his head splatter and knew that was the end of him. This murder was 15 years ago when a dozen shots sealed the fate of one of Ireland's most violent gangsters. It also slowly signaled the end of one very bloody era and started another. In the years before this well-coordinated hit, Dunn signed his own death warrant when he ordered over 17 murders during a reign of terror as Ireland's most ruthless gang boss. Many believe that criminals from the north side of Dublin carried out the murder, with the orders coming from Christy Kinahan's crime family, who were based in Spain at the time. I have a few videos covering the Kinahan Cartel and their notoriety, so if you want to watch some of those, links are in the description. Dunn's former associates are believed to have helped set him up because he had become too violent and saw his killing spree as being bad for business. Being associated with a man like him, who had stepped on so many toes, would eventually put you in the crosshairs of rival factions. A lot has changed in Ireland's gangland over the years after Dunn's death. The gangland murders dropped significantly after the Don was taken out. Just the year before, there were 29 gangland murders in 2009. In 2010, there were 20, including Eamon Dunn's own murder. In 2011, those numbers dropped to 11 murders linked to organised crime. The years that followed saw roughly a dozen gangland murders a year. As well as lowering the number of gangland murders, Dunn's death left a big hole in his gang. They were weakened by his execution, which led to fights over control in the underworld, fights that rising gangs and gangsters wanted to fill. This inevitably led to more violence. One of Dunn's closest allies, Brian O'Reilly, was targeted on 2 separate occasions. In August 2010, a real IRA gang led by Alan Ryan, encouraged by the killing of Dunn, tried to take out O'Reilly in a pub in Bettystown, located in Meath. Ryan's gang was demanding extortion payments from the former associates of Eamon Dunn, who were now seen as weak on the streets following Dunn's death. The same gang also targeted another former ally of Dunn called the Untouchable, Eamon Kelly. In September 2010, they attempted to shoot him outside his home on Furry Park Road in Killester, a quiet middle-class suburb in North Dublin, located about 5 kilometres from the city centre. It's part of the Dublin 5 postal district and sits between Clontarf, Raheny and Artane. This attack failed because the shooter's gun jammed, but Kelly was eventually shot and killed by them in December 2012. O'Reilly was shot in June 2014 in another attempt on his life outside a gym in Balbriggan, North Dublin. The year before, in 2013, one of O'Reilly's close pals, Derek McLaughlin from Ballymun, was also targeted in May of that year. This happened in a car park at the Castle Shopping Centre in Swords when a gunman walked up to him, but again another hit was foiled because of a jammed gun. Both men were pallbearers at Dunn's funeral. Another man who also carried the coffin was jailed in 2015. Mark Buckley was sent to prison for 2 years after he was convicted with 4 other men for attacking a man in a pub. During the attack, Buckley punched the man, threw a pint glass at him, and used a bar stool to hit the victim while he was on the ground. It's also worth stating that associates of Buckley were believed to be responsible for the murder of Paul Cullen, who was shot and killed in a Cabra pub in March 2013. Other men who carried Dunn's coffin have had a rough time since his death. Brothers Alan and Wayne Bradley from Finglas, along with their associate Geoffrey Morrow, were jailed for their part in a conspiracy to rob a cash van. Another associate of Dunn, Sean Enright, was shot in 2 separate attempts since the Don's death. The bodybuilder cheated death in January 2011 when he was blasted in a parked car outside a house in Clonsilla. The men behind this hit were believed to be the real IRA. He also survived another gun attack outside a gym in Glasnevin in May 2013. Carl Wynne, a man originally from Finglas, was arrested for this shooting. He was a hitman for hire and eventually died in July 2013, days after he himself was shot in a gun attack. The man who was expected to benefit the most from Dunn's death was Micah Kelly, known as the Panda. He didn't live to reap those illegal benefits, as he too was targeted by the real IRA and killed in September 2011. The one criminal who took advantage of both Dunn and Kelly's murders was the gangland boss known as Mr. Big. He cemented himself as the biggest drug dealer in Dublin's north side in the years that followed. While being on top, he too was a target of the real IRA, but avoided the same fate as Kelly by striking first. It is believed that the notorious gangster ordered the murder of Alan Ryan, who was shot and killed in September 2012, creating one of the biggest gangland murder news stories since the murder of Dunn. Another man who thought he would benefit from Dunn's death was Gareth Hopkins from Cabra. Educated at Trinity College in Dublin and going by the moniker Mr. Clean, he created connections with a veteran criminal from Ballyfermot to start a large-scale drug importation scheme, sourcing drugs from Europe. However, he didn't get far with this scheme, as his luck ran out when he was jailed in 2013 for 13 years after admitting to importing more than 29 million euros worth of cocaine in 2012. A man linked to the missing armed robber and drug dealer Sean Dunn also grew his drug dealing operation after Dunn's death. The 37-year-old man from Donaghmead was based in Meath and ran a major drugs operation suspected of bringing in over 40 million euros worth of cannabis into Ireland and the UK over a 2-year period. He was arrested over a major drugs bust, but was never charged for it. He remained the main contender for the title to control Dunn's empire. At the very top of the drugs food chain, Eamon Dunn's murder cemented his ruthless reputation as the real godfather of crime. In sanctioning a hit on their own associate, the Kinahan Cartel made it clear everyone was a target while they ruled the Irish drugs trade from overseas. Dunn was labelled evil and was said to be a paranoid mess before his death, going on drug-fueled benders and with increased pressure from the Gardaí that affected his bank balance. Some say he was a likeable person, but that likeable exterior was just a mask for his darker nature. Dunn was not the typical criminal that ran in the streets. He was well educated and completed school. A short, bald man, Dunn would appear ordinary to the untrained eye, a man who hated media attention for obvious reasons. If you tried to fill the space left by the death of Eamon Dunn, you wouldn't only have criminal gangs going after you. Law enforcement was watching and trying their best to take down any criminal that chose to rise to the occasion. One notable figure who tried was Christopher Waldron, who was targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau, who took 2 houses and 20,000 euros in designer watches. They suspected his lavish life was being funded by the supply of drugs and his association with the murdered Dunn. 2 of Waldron's homes were identified by officers, mainly Christopher Waldron's family home on Killala Road, Cabra, located on Dublin's north side, where he had been arrested before. They sanctioned Waldron so he couldn't sell any of the assets identified, which also included another house on Mellows Road in Finglas. Other items listed were a Rolex watch valued at 17,000 euros and 2 other women's designer watches. Christopher Waldron is also the brother of convicted drug dealer David Waldron, who was also under investigation for obtaining assets through the proceeds of crime. Let's take a look at who Eamon Dunn was before the dangerous and dreadful life he lived. Eamon Dunn was born in Dublin on the 17th of February 1976 and grew up in the working-class neighbourhoods of Finglas and Cabra, areas long marked by tight community bonds, limited opportunities, and a growing undercurrent of criminal activity. Those who knew him in his youth described a clever, quietly observant boy who didn't fit the stereotype of a street thug. He was articulate, intelligent, and did well enough in school to complete his leaving certificate, something few of his future associates ever achieved. After school, Dunn worked briefly in legitimate jobs. He spent time in the meat wholesale trade and later drove taxis around North Dublin. For a while, he appeared to be heading toward a straightforward life, even running a small motor business that acted as a front for what would soon become his true profession: organised crime. By his mid-20s, Dunn had drifted firmly into Dublin's underworld, where money, loyalty, and violence dictated status. Dunn first made his name under the wing of Martin Marlo Hyland, a senior drug trafficker who controlled much of North Dublin's heroin and cocaine supply in the early 2000s. Working as one of Hyland's enforcers, Dunn learned the mechanics of large-scale drug importation, street distribution, and the need for control through fear. He was known for precision and discipline, traits that distinguished him from the impulsive violence common in Dublin's gang scene. When Hyland's empire began to crumble amid police pressure and internal distrust, Dunn emerged as a trusted lieutenant, someone capable of managing operations without drawing attention. He used contacts built through legitimate-looking businesses to launder money and move vehicles used in drug deliveries. Garda intelligence later suggested that Dunn was deeply involved in the logistics of trafficking, not just on the streets, but at the wholesale level, coordinating shipments, safe houses, and cash collection. Those who dealt with Dunn described him as calm, deliberate, and almost unnervingly polite. He dressed sharply, spoke softly, and maintained an image that blended businessman with criminal strategist. As his influence grew, he began to form his own network, recruiting from Finglas and Cabra, expanding into neighbouring districts like Ballymun and Phibsborough. His organisation operated with military efficiency. Drugs came in bulk, were cut and packaged in safe flats, then distributed through trusted local dealers. By the mid-2000s, Dunn was considered one of the most powerful figures in Dublin's criminal hierarchy. His wealth grew rapidly, reflected in cars, properties, and overseas connections. Yet he remained low profile compared to flashier gang leaders. He preferred quiet authority and loyalty enforced through reputation rather than public displays of wealth. Garda sources credited him with running one of the most disciplined supply chains in the capital, controlling territory that stretched across North Dublin and parts of Meath. Despite the growing Garda attention, Dunn was rarely caught with drugs or cash. He operated through intermediaries, avoided electronic communication when possible, and insulated himself behind layers of trusted associates. In the years before his downfall, he had become both feared and respected, a man viewed as intelligent enough to build an empire and ruthless enough to protect it. By 2010, Eamon the Don Dunn had transformed from a quiet boy from Finglas into the dominant figure of Dublin's underworld, a criminal whose name carried the weight of authority across Ireland's capital. After Eamon Dunn was gunned down inside that Dublin pub, Gardaí feared the worst, that his death would trigger a full-scale gangland war. For years, Dunn had ruled his territory in North Dublin with fear and violence. Once he was gone, everyone wanted a piece of what he left behind. Tensions exploded almost immediately. Detectives believed that some of Dunn's own bodyguards had stood aside during the hit, suggesting that his murder was an inside job. He had armed protection with him that night, but when the masked gunman stormed in, nobody lifted a finger. Garda sources later said those same associates were likely in on the hit. It was betrayal from within, the people closest to him wanting him gone, hungry for his empire. But Dunn's downfall didn't just spark problems inside his old crew. An external threat emerged too, a faction calling itself the Real IRA. These were dissident Republicans who had long mixed politics with organised crime. Once Dunn was out of the picture, they moved in on his former turf. They started extorting dealers, taking cuts from the trade, and using their so-called revolutionary image as cover for drug dealing. Within months, a deadly feud erupted between what was left of Dunn's gang and this Real IRA group. The killings came one after another. Colm Owens, one of Dunn's old friends and drivers, was shot dead in Finglas in July 2010. Then Sean Winters, another senior member, was gunned down in Portmarnock that September. Gardaí believed the Real IRA was behind both murders, sending a clear message: they were taking over. Dunn's loyalists didn't back down. They hit back hard. One of their first retaliations was the killing of Daniel Gaynor, a 25-year-old gunman tied to the Real IRA. Gaynor was known as a hired shooter, and his murder was payback for the attacks on Dunn's men. It became a cycle of bloodshed, a shadow war between gangland figures and dissident Republicans. This uneasy clash raged across 2010 and into the next year. But it ended as violently as it began. In 2012, Alan Ryan, the Dublin leader of the Real IRA, was shot dead in broad daylight. His murder was widely believed to have been carried out by criminals sick of his extortion rackets. Ryan's death effectively dismantled the Real IRA's power in Dublin. With him gone, the turf war faded out and the city's underworld calmed. Surprisingly, the massive bloodbath Gardaí had feared never fully happened. After Dunn's murder, there were flare-ups, but nothing like the all-out war many expected. Finglas and Cabra went quieter. No new Don stepped up with the same arrogance or brutality. The violence cooled off, and Gardaí noticed a drop in gangland killings in the years that followed. Dunn's death, in a strange way, brought temporary peace. But beneath the surface, the drug trade kept moving. Dunn's gang had once dominated North Dublin's supply lines, importing cocaine and heroin, distributing to smaller crews, and controlling the streets. When he was alive, he sourced his drugs from larger traffickers abroad, mainly the Kinahan Cartel based in Spain. He was one of their biggest Irish distributors. By 2009, though, Dunn's ego had become a problem. He'd killed too many people, brought too much attention, and was undercutting other dealers by selling cheap cocaine. His suppliers, including Kinahan's network, were furious. They warned him to stop, to raise his prices and calm down. But Dunn refused. He was high on power and cocaine, convinced he couldn't be touched. That arrogance sealed his fate. By early 2010, the Kinahan group and at least one older Dublin godfather, a mentor of Dunn's, quietly agreed he had to go. He was bad for business. Garda sources later suggested that some of his own lieutenants helped set him up, working with hitmen from the inner city to carry out the ambush. The Don had become a liability, and the Underworld decided to remove him. After his murder, his crew splintered. Some parts of his network were taken over by his former right-hand men. Others aligned with rival factions, but everyone kept a low profile. They'd seen what happened when someone got too loud, too violent, and too visible. The result was a quieter, more business-like underworld, one where money flowed more than bullets. The cocaine and heroin routes kept running, mostly through the same Spanish suppliers, but with new faces handling distribution. Without Dunn, there was no chaos, no daily gunfire. The trade became less public, more organized. Garda intelligence at the time described the city's criminal scene as calmer, less murder, more quiet deals. By the mid-2000s, a new generation began to rise. Younger bosses in areas like Finglas and Blanchardstown, including the figure later known as Mr. Flashy, took over where Dunn once ruled. They too built links with the Kinahan cartel, keeping the supply chain alive. Violence would return in time, but for several years after 2010, Dublin's gangland was fractured and subdued, a stark contrast to Dunn's reign of terror. The investigation into Dunn's murder became one of the biggest in modern Irish history. Dozens of detectives were assigned to track down his killers. Early reports suggested 4 gunmen were involved, possibly including hired hitmen. Gardaí looked at 2 main theories. 1, that the Kinahan cartel ordered the hit from abroad, and 2, that Dublin crime figures, including Dunn's own allies, turned on him. Both turned out to be partly true. Gardaí later concluded that local gangsters carried it out, possibly with quiet approval from senior figures overseas. Several suspects were arrested in the following years, but no one was ever charged. Some were later targeted themselves. One suspected hitman even had his home sprayed with bullets after being released. To this day, the case remains unsolved. No one has ever been convicted of killing Eamon Dunn. Gardaí still call the file open, but in reality, everyone on the streets knows what happened. His murder was a professional hit, clean, fast, and perfectly executed. Eamon Dunn's story became a warning in Irish gangland. He had it all: money, fear, power, and he lost it because he couldn't control himself. His paranoia, his greed, and his violence made him untouchable for a while, until the people around him decided he wasn't. His death changed everything. It stopped one of Dublin's bloodiest feuds, stabilized the drug trade, and reminded every gangster that nobody, not even the Don, was beyond reach. For a while, Dublin's streets were quieter, not safer, but more controlled. And in that silence, the lesson was clear: the louder you rise, the harder you fall.
It was a quiet Monday night in November 2019 in Bettystown, a seaside town in County Meath, the kind of place where people commute to Dublin, raise their kids, and mind their own business. Most residents were already settling in for the night when gunshots shattered the suburban calm. The violence that erupted on Castlemartin Drive would expose one of Ireland's most brutal gang feuds, drag a small community into national headlines, and demonstrate just how far organized crime had spread beyond the cities. This is the story of Richard "Richie" Carberry, a man caught between two worlds, whose double life as both family man and drug supplier ultimately led to his execution on his own driveway. But before we dive into this story, if you're finding this content valuable, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We cover the most compelling true crime cases from Ireland and beyond, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Let me tell you about Richie Carberry, 39 years old, married to Eileen, father of 3 kids, Cody, Charlie, and young Callum. If you saw him around Bettystown, you'd think he was just another suburban dad, maybe doing well for himself, sure. He drove a nice black Audi Q7, lived in a decent house on Castle Martin Drive. But Richie Carberry wasn't your average family man. See, Carberry had grown up in Coolock, North Dublin, tough area. And somewhere along the way, he'd gotten involved in the drug trade, not as some street corner dealer. No, Richie was what they call a supplier, the guy who moved serious weight, the guy other dealers came to when they needed stock. And he was good at it, really good. Here's the thing about guys like Carberry. They're not the stereotypical criminals you see in movies. He only had 3 convictions, all minor public order stuff. Nothing that would land him in prison for years. He was smart, kept his head down, used other people to do the dirty work, but being smart in the drug game only gets you so far. Because eventually, if you're successful enough, you're going to step on someone's toes. And in Ireland, that someone might just be from Drogheda. Now, if you don't know Drogheda, it's one of Ireland's oldest towns. Sits right on the border between County Louth and County Meath, about 30 miles north of Dublin. Beautiful historic place. They even hosted a major music festival there. But by 2019, Drogheda had another reputation. It had become the epicenter of one of Ireland's most vicious gang wars. See, there were 2 main factions fighting over drug territory around Drogheda, and Richie Carberry, living just down the road in Bettystown, had picked a side. He was supplying one crew with drugs, maybe weapons too, making serious money. But the other side, they weren't having it. The first warning came in March 2019. Carberry's house on Castle Martin Drive gets shot up. Bullets flying into a residential estate. Could have hit anyone. Kids, elderly neighbors, didn't matter to these guys. Now, when most people get their house shot up, they call the police, right? Maybe think about moving far away? Not Richie Carberry. He refused to cooperate with the Gardaí, wouldn't give them any information about who might have done it or why. That's the criminal code. You handle your own problems. But he wasn't stupid either. He moved his family to a rented place in nearby Laytown for safety. And at the Castle Martin house, he installed bulletproof glass and a comprehensive CCTV system. Think about that for a minute. Bulletproof glass in suburban Ireland. That's when you know things have gotten serious. But here's the crucial mistake Carberry made. Even though he'd moved his family out, he kept going back to that house. Maybe for meetings, maybe to collect things. Who knows? The one thing he should have done was stay away completely. Now, I need to tell you about a gangland hitman named Robbie Lawler, because understanding Lawler is key to understanding what happened to Richie Carberry. Lawler was Carberry's brother-in-law, married to Carberry's wife's sister, but their family connection was about the only normal thing about Robbie Lawler. By April 2020, this guy had racked up 125 previous convictions. 125. We're talking armed robberies, firearms offenses, you name it. In 2013, he'd held a gun to a security guard's head during a robbery at McDonald's. But that's not what made Lawler truly dangerous. Lawler was what they call an enforcer. When someone needed killing, they called Robbie. The guards suspected him of involvement in at least 3 murders, including a guy named Kenneth Finn in 2018, and David Lynch way back in 2005. This wasn't some hot-headed young criminal. This was a professional killer who'd been at it for years, and he was completely ruthless. Media reports described him as sadistic, the kind of guy who didn't just kill his enemies, he wanted to humiliate them, terrorize them, send a message. The guards had warned Lawler repeatedly that his life was in danger. Did he care? Not a bit. He kept moving around openly, kept doing what he was doing. That kind of fearlessness? It's not bravery. It's the mark of someone who's lost touch with normal human emotions, someone who gets off on the power, the fear he creates. And when his brother-in-law Richie Carberry got shot up in March, well, that was personal. So we come to November 4th, 2019, a Monday night that would change everything. Richie Carberry had been abroad. The dossier doesn't say where, but guys in his line of work travel for business, if you know what I mean. He flew back into Dublin Airport that evening, landed around 10:30. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Someone knew his schedule. Someone knew he was coming back that night. Because what happened next wasn't random. It was planned, organized, professional. Carberry collected his car from the airport and drove a friend home first. Good guy, right? Always helping people out. Then he headed to Bettystown, probably thinking about getting home, maybe checking on the house. It was about 11:40 p.m. when he pulled up to Castle Martin Drive in his black Audi Q7. Picture the scene. Quiet residential street. Most people already in bed. Streetlights casting those orange pools of light. Carberry parks, gets out, walks to close the gate behind his car. That's when he sees the white van. A Peugeot Bipper van, just sitting there. Probably didn't think much of it at first. Could be anyone, right? Delivery driver taking a break. Someone visiting a neighbor. But then a man gets out. And this man is carrying an automatic pistol. Now, Carberry had survived the March shooting. He'd installed all that security, moved his family away, but all the bulletproof glass in the world doesn't help you when you're standing in your own driveway. The gunman opened fire, 6 shots, maybe more, the sound echoing off the houses, shattering the quiet suburban night. At least 2 bullets hit Carberry. Others went wide, smashing into his Audi, hitting neighbors' cars. This wasn't some careful surgical hit. This was spray and pray. And thank God none of those stray bullets went through anyone's windows.
The gunman hit a number of cars in the area. They say that this is a family estate and any of these bullets could have gone in the window of any of the houses in the estate. And numerous people afraid to talk on camera today, expressing their concern and their fear for their safety and for the safety of their kids.
The neighbors heard the shots, looked out their windows, saw Richie Carberry lying in his driveway, blood pooling beneath him, and the white van already gone. Within minutes, the street was full of flashing lights, Gardaí, paramedics, the whole circus. They found Carberry still conscious, but badly wounded. Here's something that shows you how serious they knew this was. A Garda officer actually drove the ambulance to the hospital. That doesn't happen for your average shooting. They knew this was gang-related, knew there might be more violence coming. They rushed Carberry to Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda, but the damage was too severe. He went into cardiac arrest on the way and was pronounced dead at 12:57 a.m. Richie Carberry, father of 3, was gone. But the killers, they were just getting started on their escape plan. See, this wasn't some amateur job. Whoever planned this had thought it through carefully. They'd used the white Peugeot van for the actual shooting, but they had a second vehicle waiting. Witnesses saw the killer switch to a blue Ford Fiesta with the registration 06D80233. And then this car took off on a very specific route, Culp Road, Donacarney, past the Southgate Shopping Center, onto the N1 at Julianstown. Think about that route for a minute. These guys knew the area. They'd planned this out. Maybe even done practice runs through Knoll Village, through Ballybogle, out into the countryside. And at 12:15 a.m., about 40 minutes after the shooting, that blue Ford Fiesta got torched in a field near Ballybogle, just like the white van had been burned earlier. Both getaway vehicles destroyed. All the forensic evidence, fingerprints, DNA, gunshot residue, gone up in smoke. These weren't street thugs acting on impulse. This was organized, professional, military-level planning. Superintendent Fergus Dwyer was the man tasked with catching Carberry's killer. And let me tell you, he was walking into a nightmare.
This man, we believe, was targeted before, last March. We have active patrols in the area. It's part of an operational plan that we have. And in fact, members were just here at the scene about 30 minutes beforehand as part of our operational plan here.
See, investigating gang murders is nothing like the detective shows on TV. In a normal murder, people want to help. Witnesses come forward, families cooperate, the community rallies around finding justice. But in Gangland, everyone's got a reason to keep their mouth shut.
Nobody seems to be able to cope with it. The authority are doing their best, but
it's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's a countrywide problem. It's in every town and village.
And numerous people afraid to talk on camera today, expressing their concern and their fear for their safety and for the safety of their kids.
The guards did everything right. They sealed off the crime scene immediately, preserved every bit of evidence they could find. They had Carberry's CCTV system, which had captured the whole thing. They traced the route of both getaway vehicles. They even put out public appeals through Garda Crime Call, asking for anyone who'd seen the vehicles, anyone with information. But here's the problem with gang murders. The most important witnesses are usually criminals themselves. And criminals don't talk to police, ever. Plus, the feud had the whole area terrorized. People were scared. You see a gang shooting, you don't become a witness, you become a target. The vehicle forensics should have been the breakthrough. 2 cars, both used in the crime, but burning them had destroyed almost everything. Almost. Because here's where it gets interesting. In July 2024, nearly 5 years after the murder, LMFM radio reported something huge, a personal item left in the burned Ford Fiesta, something the fire hadn't completely destroyed. And this item linked back to a specific man, a Dubliner in his 30s, who was facing extradition from Spain for another murder entirely. Think about that. 5 years later, and a tiny piece of evidence that survived the fire might finally crack the case. But let's talk about what happened to the key players in this story, because that's where the real tragedy lies. Remember Robbie Lawler, Carberry's psychotic brother-in-law? Well, Lawler had his own theory about who killed Richie. In December 2019, just a month after the murder, Lawler got mugged.
Yes! That's only the start of it! That's only the start of it! That's only the start of it, Robbie!
Some kids jumped him, stole his gym bag. Sounds pretty minor, right? Wrong. One of those kids was 17-year-old Keen Mulready Woods, and Lawler was convinced the teenager had been involved in Carberry's killing somehow. What happened next was so horrific, it shocked even hardened crime reporters.
Woods was reported missing by his mother on January 13, 2020, and partial remains belonging to the teenager were found at various locations in Dublin in the following days, with further remains found in Drogheda.
In January 2020, Keen Mulready Woods was murdered and dismembered in Dublin. Parts of his body were found in different locations around the city. And here's the really sick part. Robbie Lawler left a pair of flip-flops with the remains. His flip-flops, the ones that had been stolen during that mugging. That was his calling card, his signature. He was telling everyone, this is what happens when you mess with me. A 17-year-old kid butchered like an animal because a psychopath thought he might have been involved in his brother-in-law's murder. But Lawler's reign of terror was coming to an end too. In April 2020, he traveled to Belfast with some associates. They were there to collect drug debts. Business as usual for a guy like Lawler. But someone was waiting for him. Robbie Lawler, the man suspected of at least 3 murders. The enforcer who terrorized enemies across 2 countries got shot dead in Belfast. The most violent figure in the feud was gone, but the damage was done. Let's talk about what this did to the community. Before November 2019, Bettystown was a quiet place. Families, commuters, people living normal lives. Then gangland violence literally came to their front doors. Counselor Sharon Tolan spoke for a lot of people when she asked, how does a gunman just drive into a residential estate and murder someone? Where were the guards? How did this happen? And she had a point. The guards knew Carberry was a target. They'd warned him his life was in danger after the March shooting. But there was no protection detail, no extra patrols, nothing. The murder exposed just how unprepared rural policing was for this level of organized crime. The government response was swift, but probably too late. They launched Operation Stratus, flooding Drogheda with extra guards. They commissioned studies, held community meetings, promised more resources. But for Richie Carberry's family, none of that mattered anymore. His wife Eileen became a widow at 39. His kids, Cody, Charlie, and Callum, lost their father. His own father, Peter Carberry, had to identify his son's body at the hospital. The funeral was held at the Church of the Sacred Heart in Laytown on November 9th. Massive turnout. But the guards were there in force too. They were worried about retaliation, about more violence at the funeral itself. That's what this feud had done. It made even funerals dangerous. Here's what really gets me about this story. Richie Carberry wasn't some street thug. He was a smart guy who thought he could walk the line between criminal and family man. He installed bulletproof glass to protect his home. He moved his family to safety after the first shooting. He had CCTV, security measures, all the precautions a man in his position could take. But he kept going back to that house. Maybe he thought he was untouchable. Maybe he thought his enemies weren't smart enough to get him. He was wrong. The Drogheda feud shows you what happens when drug money meets unlimited violence. These weren't the old school criminals who followed certain rules, who kept civilians out of it. These were guys who would shoot up a residential street, murder a teenager, and dismember him. Terrorize entire communities without a second thought. And the technology made them more dangerous. They used burner phones, encrypted messaging, sophisticated getaway plans. They studied their targets, learned their routines, struck with military precision. But here's the irony. For all their planning, for all their violence, most of them ended up dead themselves. Richie Carberry, shot dead in his driveway. Robbie Lawler, shot dead in Belfast. Keen Mulready Woods, murdered and dismembered at 17. The feud consumed everyone it touched. As of 2024, Richie Carberry's murder remains officially unsolved. That personal item found in the burned car gives investigators hope. The suspect in Spain might finally face extradition. There might be justice for the Carberry family yet. But think about what this case shows us about modern organized crime. These criminals are using counter-surveillance techniques, burning evidence, planning operations like military strikes. They're operating across international borders, using technology to stay ahead of law enforcement. The guards are good at what they do, but they're often fighting the last war. They're set up to investigate traditional crimes, domestic violence, burglary, drunk driving. But when you've got criminals with automatic weapons planning coordinated hits across multiple counties, using burner phones and encrypted apps, burning forensic evidence and intimidating witnesses, that's a whole different game. And small communities like Bettystown, places where people thought they were safe from this kind of violence, they're learning that nowhere is really safe anymore. The drug trade has too much money in it. The criminals are too well organized, and they're too willing to use extreme violence to protect their interests. Look, I've covered a lot of gangland murders over the years, but this one sticks with me because of how it shows the evolution of organized crime in Ireland. Richie Carberry thought he could be a suburban family man and a drug supplier at the same time. He thought bulletproof glass and CCTV cameras would keep him safe. Robbie Lawler thought his reputation for extreme violence would protect him. He thought he was untouchable. They were both wrong. The Drogheda feud claimed dozens of victims. It terrorized communities across 3 counties. It showed that Irish criminals could match anything coming out of Mexico or Colombia for sheer brutality. But here's the thing about feuds. They always burn themselves out eventually. Most of the major players are dead now. The survivors are either in prison or exile. The question is, what comes next? Because the drug trade isn't going anywhere. The money is still there. And there are always young men willing to kill for their piece of it. Richie Carberry's story is a warning. It shows what happens when ordinary people get drawn into extraordinary violence. It shows how suburban communities can become battlegrounds overnight. And it shows that no matter how smart you think you are, no matter what precautions you take, the life always catches up with you in the end. For the Carberry family, the wait for justice continues. For the community of Bettystown, the scars remain. And for law enforcement, the lessons learned in blood are still being applied to fight the next generation of criminals. That white van pulling up outside Richie Carberry's house changed everything. It brought the reality of gangland violence into a quiet residential street. It shattered the illusion that some places, some people, were safe from this world. And 5 years later, we're still trying to pick up the pieces. The murder of Richie Carberry wasn't just another gangland hit. It was a turning point, a moment when Ireland realized that organized crime had evolved, had become more dangerous, more sophisticated, more willing to bring extreme violence into ordinary communities. That's the real tragedy of November 4th, 2019. Not just that a father of 3 was gunned down in his own driveway, but that it could happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And maybe, just maybe, it already has. The murder of Richie Carberry serves as a stark reminder that organized crime continues to evolve and adapt. What happened in Bettystown wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of violence that can emerge in any community when criminal enterprises take root. Stay vigilant. Be aware of what's happening in your neighborhoods. Report suspicious activity to authorities. And remember that the choices we make, the company we keep, and the paths we choose can have consequences that ripple far beyond ourselves. If you found this deep dive into the Carberry case compelling, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We'll continue bringing you the most detailed investigations into Ireland's most significant criminal cases. There are more stories to tell, more mysteries to unravel, and more lessons to learn from the darker corners of our society. Until next time, stay safe out there.
In today's video, we head over to Belfast, where an enforcer who took a €100,000 down payment to kill one of Ireland's most wanted man at time. The job was meant to end with the death of Jerry the Monk Hutch, the head of the Hutch organised crime group. Instead, the hit would never happen, and Hutch would walk free from the Special Criminal Court, and the man promised the big payout would find himself back in prison. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment with your thoughts. It really helps us to keep bringing you in-depth true crime stories. Thank you. Now let's dive back in. We go back to 2017, when Daniel Kinahan was running his cartel from the shadows in Dubai. Under immense pressure after the deadly Regency Hotel attack, he wanted the monk taken out. For that, he turned to Gerard Mackin, a thug from West Belfast with a history of extreme violence. A man with convictions for torture with a nail gun, crucifying victims to slabs of concrete, shooting taxi drivers during sectarian feuds, and forming his own terror cell cell after being overlooked for promotion within the Irish National Liberation Army. Kinahan promised Mackin €1 million if he was able to do the hit. To show he was serious, Daniel handed over €100,000 in cash as a down payment. Mackin was flown into Dublin to meet and collect the money for the hit and told to find an opportunity to kill Gerry Hutch. But in a twist that nobody expected, Hutch would later be found not guilty of murder at the Regency Hotel trial. The verdict would see him walk out the front doors of the Central Criminal Courts of Justice, while Mackin was left in Portloy's prison, guilty not of murder but of money laundering. Back in September 2015, the fragile peace between two of Ireland's most notorious families shattered. Gerry Hutch's nephew, Gary Hutch, was shot dead in Marbella, Spain. That killing was allegedly ordered by Daniel Kinahan, and it started one of the bloodiest gangland feuds in Irish history. From that moment, the Hutch family and the Kinahan Cartel were at war. The violence came to a head on the 5th of February 2016 at the Regency Hotel in North Dublin. Masked men dressed in tactical gear, armed with AK-47 assault rifles, stormed the hotel lobby during a boxing weigh-in. Their target was Daniel. He escaped unharmed, but Kinahan Lieutenant David Byrne was shot dead. The images of men in police-style uniforms running through the hotel lobby with assault rifles shocked the country. It was a declaration of war. The fallout was immediate. Kinahan's crew began a wave of retaliatory hits across Dublin. Hutch associates were murdered one by one, often in broad daylight, as the cartel tried to wipe out their rivals. In response, the Hutch side tightened their circle. Houses were put under armed Garda watch, associates went into hiding, and Gerry Hutch himself disappeared from view. The feud escalated so quickly that the Gardaí launched a major security operation. Armed checkpoints appeared on Dublin streets, convoys of detectives monitored the homes of potential targets, and the Special Criminal Court began handling cases connected to the war. Politicians called it the most serious threat to the state since the days of paramilitary violence. Meanwhile, Daniel Kinahan was cementing his position abroad. From Dubai, he orchestrated his empire, insulated from day-to-day risks on the streets of Dublin. But one name continued to haunt him, Gerry Hutch. Known as the Monk, Hutch was a veteran of the Dublin underworld. He had built his reputation as a careful and calculating figure, someone who had survived long enough to become a symbol of defiance against the cartel. For Kinahan, letting Hutch live was not an option. The feud had already claimed dozens of lives, but Hutch remained at the center of it all, respected, feared, and still standing. The cartel leadership wanted him dead, and for that, they were willing to pay big money. That is when Gerard Mackin entered the picture. By 2019, Mackin was back on Irish soil after years moving between Belfast, Dublin, and Spain. A man with a proven history of violence, known for torture, shootings, and extortion, he was exactly the kind of enforcer Kinahan wanted for the job. The down payment was set at €100,000, with the promise of 10 times that amount once the Monk was taken out. The Hutch-Kinahan feud had turned Dublin into a battleground, and it was about to draw in one of Belfast's most notorious paramilitary enforcers. The stage was set for a murder that never happened, but the fallout would change everything. To understand how Gerard Mackin ended up with a €1 million bounty contract, we have to go back to his beginnings in West Belfast. Born into a community scarred by sectarian violence, Mackin grew up surrounded by paramilitary influence. By his late teens, he was already immersed in that world, aligning himself with the Irish National Liberation Army. But even among men hardened by decades of conflict, Mackin stood out for his sheer brutality. In 2009, he became the first person ever to be convicted in a Dublin court for a murder committed in Belfast. The charge related to the shooting of taxi driver Eddie Burns. But in 2010, that conviction was overturned by the Court of Criminal Appeal. A retrial was ordered, but it collapsed after only 3 days. With witnesses too terrified to testify, Mackin walked free. It was a pattern that would follow him, with violence so extreme that victims were often too scared to speak in court. In September 2015, Mackin was part of a 3-man team that tortured a man in one of the most sadistic assaults the Irish courts had ever heard. The victim was nailed to the floor with a nail gun, beaten with sticks, and left with lasting injuries. Mackin and his accomplices laughed during the attack. In court years later, one witness recalled him saying the attempt on the man's life was a bit of a laugh. His alliances shifted constantly. He once worked under Irish National Liberation Army boss, but fell out after being denied a leadership role. Instead, he formed his own breakaway faction known as the New Irish National Liberation Army, a ragtag group that mixed paramilitary violence with gangland ambition. By the time of the Hutch-Kinahan feud, most of his faction had either disbanded or drifted into organized crime. Mackin himself moved between Spain and Ireland, maintaining links with both dissident Republicans and cartel figures. In 2019, he was back in Dublin, closely tied to Daniel Kinahan and tasked with helping run a supply line into Ireland. He was exactly the type of criminal who thrived on chaos, equally at home in a political feud or a gangland war. When Kinahan handed him €100,000 to kill Jerry Hutch, it was the biggest job Mackin had ever been given, but it would prove to be the beginning of his downfall. By 2019, Daniel Kinahan was firmly entrenched in Dubai. He had turned the desert city into his command center, away from Irish justice, but still pulling the strings of the cartel's empire across Europe. His organization was under pressure. Many of his associates had been arrested, assets were being seized, and the Hutch gang remained a thorn in his side. At the very center of that threat was Jerry the Monk Hutch. Kinahan decided to put a price on his head, €1 million. It was a staggering bounty, even in gangland terms, enough to tempt only the most ruthless of enforcers. For Kinahan, the choice of who would carry out the job was simple. He needed someone who had proven he could instill fear, someone without hesitation, someone with no ties left to lose. That man was Gerard Mackin. At the same time, Mackin was given a broader role. He was tasked with overseeing one of the cartel's supply line into Ireland. The Kinahan leadership saw him as a valuable asset, a man who could keep product moving while also hunting down their greatest rival. But Mackin's return to Dublin raised eyebrows. He was a Belfast thug, now walking among cartel heavyweights, men who viewed themselves as new age gangsters, businessmen rather than gunmen. His background in dissident paramilitaries and torture squads made him volatile, unpredictable. To some, he was a useful enforcer. To others, a liability waiting to explode. While the contract loomed, the reality of killing Jerry Hutch was more complicated than Kinahan made it sound. Hutch was a seasoned operator, surrounded by family, friends, and a community that still shielded him. Gardaí had his home under surveillance since the Regency Hotel attack. Moving on him would require more than just brutality. It would take precision, planning, and luck. For Mackin, the contract was finished before it ever began. The €1 million payday vanished. Instead of being remembered as the man who killed Jerry Hutch, he was left with nothing but the advance money in his pocket and the eyes of the law closing in. The monk survived the feud, with his name intact, with Daniel always on the run, and Mackin's path leading back to prison walls. The story of Gerard Mackin's downfall didn't come with the kind of headline he expected. There was no dramatic trial for the murder of Jerry Hutch, not a cross-examination about a €1 million contract. Instead, Mackin found himself in front of the Special Criminal Court on a far smaller charge of money laundering. In December 2022, he was extradited from Alicante in Spain on a European arrest warrant. Gardaí had built a case that tied him to €4,760, believed to be the proceeds of drug dealing. For a man who had tortured victims and had once been offered a fortune to kill Ireland's most wanted man, the sum was almost laughable, but it was enough to bring him back into custody and hold him in Portlaoise prison. Inside court, Mackin cut a very different figure from the hardman reputation he carried on the streets. His barrister, Ronan Kennedy, told the judges that Mackin had turned his life around. He had a new baby with his long-term partner. He had steady work with a building firm in Spain. He was, the court was told, a family man who had made poor choices in the past. The defense tried to frame him as a man shaped by circumstances. Kennedy said alcohol was a problem in Mackin's family and that his client had struggled for years. He asked the court to show leniency, but the reality was inescapable. Mackin was not a victim of circumstance. He was a notorious enforcer with a record of torture, extortion, and attempted murder. Gardaí described him as volatile, unpredictable, and deeply dangerous. Even his own breakaway, New Irish National Liberation Army faction had collapsed, its members drifting back into mainstream gangland crime. While Mackin was being painted as a man seeking redemption, Jerry Hutch was walking free. In April 2023, after a high-profile trial, Hutch was acquitted of the Regency Hotel murder. The judges ruled the evidence simply wasn't there. For Hutch, it was vindication. For Mackin, it was humiliation. He had been promised €1 million for Hutch's life. Instead, he was now pleading guilty to laundering less than $5,000. The courtroom became a theater of irony. The target free, the hitman behind bars, the cartel in retreat. Justice Mrs. Burns of the Special Criminal Court summed up the case with clinical precision. Mackin's guilty plea was noted. His claims of family responsibility were acknowledged, but the weight of his history and his associations were impossible to ignore. He was sent back to Portlaoise prison, surrounded by cartel gunmen and paramilitary veterans, the very people he once claimed he would kill for money. In the end, it wasn't the violence that nailed him, it was the paperwork. The aftermath of Gerard Mackin's conviction was a picture of brutal irony. The man who had been promised €1 million-euro payday was now sitting in Port Loy's prison. Meanwhile, Jerry Hutch, the man he was meant to kill, walked free from the Special Criminal Court and returned to his family life in Dublin. For Mackin, prison was no unfamiliar territory. He had spent years in custody before, both in the paramilitary wings and later among ordinary gangland inmates. But this time was different. He was now housed alongside members of the Kinahan Cartel, the very men who had once offered him a fortune. Patrick Hutch, convicted cartel hitmen, and other foot soldiers of the feud all shared the same walls. It was a bitter reminder that he was no longer the feared outsider with his own cell of gunmen, but just another inmate. Inside, tensions brewed. Reports surfaced of clashes between Mackin's old New Irish National Liberation Army loyalists and members of the Bayern organised crime group, the cartel faction once led in Dublin by Liam Bayern. Mackin, who had built his reputation by violence, was now forced to navigate prison politics just to survive. On the outside, Jerry Hutch was careful. Sources close to him said he had no plans to flee abroad. Instead, he chose to remain in the capital, relying on the loyalty of family, friends, and a close community to keep watch. His brother Patsy's home stayed under round-the-clock Garda surveillance, while associates like James Margo Gately lived under constant threat after multiple assassination attempts. For them, the feud was far from over, but the reality was clear. The Kinahan cartel was in retreat. Their leadership had fled to Dubai, their networks had been dismantled in Ireland, and their reputation battered by international sanctions. For Hutch, the danger remained, but the storm that had threatened to wipe out his family had passed its peak. For Mackin, the storm had closed in on him alone. The contrast could not be sharper. Hutch, once branded the most wanted man in Ireland, smiled as he told reporters it was the right decision. Mackin, once the feared enforcer promised riches, was reduced to a courtroom plea about wanting to be a family man. The man who had crucified others with nail guns now spoke about nappies and construction work in Spain. To Gardaí, the case became an example of how organised crime often collapses under its own weight. Big promises of loyalty and money mean little when the leaders are abroad, the targets are still breathing, and the enforcers are left to face the courts alone. For Mackin, there would be no redemption. His history was too violent, his reputation too toxic, and his future now tied to a prison number. For Hutch, the irony was that freedom came with its own cage, the constant threat of one last hit, the knowledge that the dying sting of the cartel could still come. When you strip this case back, what's left is a story of irony, survival, and wasted lives. Jerry Hutch, the man who was supposed to die in a hail of bullets, instead walked free from the Special Criminal Court. Gerard Mackin, the man promised a €1 million payday, now sits in Port Loy's prison, guilty of laundering less than 5,000. The contrast is almost absurd. Hutch returned to his community, older, cautious, but still standing. He remains a target, always looking over his shoulder, but his reputation intact. Mackin, once a feared enforcer who nailed men to slabs and laughed about torture, tried to convince a court that he was a family man who just wanted a new start in Spain. The judges didn't buy it. The lesson is clear. In organised crime, ambition rarely ends with riches. More often it ends with betrayal, prison, or death. Mackin believed in the promise of a €1 million bounty. He believed his violent past made him the right man for the job. What he didn't see was that he was just another disposable tool in a feud that has already chewed up dozens of men before him. For Hutch, freedom is no victory parade. His life remains under constant threat, his family watched by armed Garda units, his movements limited by the shadow of the Kinahan cartel. For Mackin, prison is a slow punishment, a reminder that his brutality didn't buy him respect, only notoriety. Researching this case shows how often these stories end the same way. Big names, big reputations, promises of untouchable power. But in the end, it's the smallest details that bring them down. Not the AK-47s or the €1 million contracts, but a bank transfer of €4,760. Not the violence itself, but the paperwork. Sometimes the system doesn't catch the crime you expect. It catches the ones left in the margins. And for men like Mackin, that's enough. In today's episode, we saw how the Kinahan cartel tried to buy the life of Jerry Hutch, how an enforcer from Belfast believed he was on the brink of fortune, and how in the end, it was all for nothing. Hutch is free, Mackin is locked up, and the feud that burned through Dublin streets has left scars that will never fully heal. More unusual crime stories coming soon. Thanks for watching.